Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Modern Day Debate. Tonight, we're going to be debating, does God exist? And to get us started, we have Travis Campbell here for the first time to debate. PhD from Westminster Theological Seminary, Masters of Theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, and also a bachelor's from Wittenberg University. Travis James Campbell has been teaching at Windsor School in Albany, Georgia for the last 20 years as a history and comparative religions teacher. Travis is the founder and president of the Consider This, an organization dedicated to the defense of classical Christianity. He also serves as a ruling elder at Northgate Presbyterian Church in Albany. Travis is the author of the book The Wonderful Degree, which addresses the problem of evil, along with several peer-reviewed essays on philosophical and theological subjects. When he isn't geeking out over philosophy or theology, he enjoys the outdoors, the movies, making fun of his students, and lots of piddling. So we got a little bio for everybody here tonight, and we're going to try to let you know all about our speakers. But with that, we have 25 per side. So Travis, the floor is all yours.
Muslims, maintaining as its core belief the existence of one supernatural and personal being who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. And this deity is the creator and sustainer of the cosmos, as well as the locus of our moral values. Beyond that core belief, there is a wide range of disagreements between Abrahamic theists, ranging from the locus of special revelation, for example, the debate between the Bible and the Quran, to the specific ways we're to understand divine power, knowledge, and goodness. While we respect all of our fellow Abrahamic theists as individuals who share with us a commitment to the one true God, our position is that of classical theism. More specifically, we affirm the theology proper upheld and defended by Thomas Aquinas and even presented in the classical reformational creeds and catechisms, recognizing that there are many pagan theists, Jews, and even Muslims who agree with our understanding of God. And so our argument tonight is inspired by the philosophical proofs given by Aquinas in his famous Summa Theologica, along with his Summa Contra Gentiles and his De Ente et Essentia, among other works. And so Richard Howe and I will be defending the following proposition in tonight's debate. The God of classical Thomistic theism exists. Here is an outline of our argument. At least one contingent being exists. Whatever is contingent is currently being caused to exist by another. There are at least two beings that exist in a cause-effect relationship. An infinite regress of concurrently contingent causes and effects is impossible, and therefore, there is at least one cause of the sum total of contingent causes and effects. The cause of the series of contingent causes and effects cannot itself be contingent. The cause of the series of contingent causes and effects cannot itself be self-caused. The cause of the series of contingent causes and effects is uncaused, and therefore, at least one uncaused cause exists. The uncaused cause is necessary or timelessly eternal, absolute or ultimate, immutable, infinite, self-existent or independent, impassible, immaterial, perfect, transcendent, and one, or unique and simple. The uncaused cause is omnipotent, omnipresent, or immense, omniscient, which is to say, truth, mind, logic, and wisdom, omnibenevolent, which is to say, volition, justice, love, joy, light, beauty, and perfection, and purely spiritual, that is to say, incorporeal, personal, paternal, immanent, relational. And finally, he is apprehensible and yet incomprehensible. The uncaused cause just is everything classical Thomistic theists believe their God to be, and therefore, the God of classical Thomistic theism exists. And so we offer a brief defense of each premise and conclusion. So premise number one, at least one contingent being exists. Something undeniably exists. There are multiple facts to behold by our senses, and once we understand that something is, we immediately recognize that everything that we perceive and experience is contingent. Something is contingent just in case it is changing or corruptible, moving, impermanent, and composite. Something is contingent just in case it is finite or limited, bounded, and fixed. So something is contingent just in case it is changing, finite, and dependent upon other things for its existence. Our argument is not metaphysically neutral, and yet it is possible to arrive at our metaphysics through an appeal to sense experiences we all hold in common. Indeed, we contend that the physical world all around us manifests change, finitude, and dependency, precisely because impermanency, composition, and diversity are fundamental constituents of at least one aspect of reality. In other words, contingent beings exist. That proposition is not merely a physical fact, though it is that. It is a metaphysical truth that contains within it a window into the supernatural realm. Sense perception is what we do, in the words of John Canassis, when we look this way and listen. And quite remarkably, human perception is able to apprehend the form of things, thereby grasping what they are, and is simultaneously able to judge that this form exists while that one does not. For example, I can conceive of multiple forms or essences that do not exist, like Darth Vader, unicorns, and Adolf Hitler's fifth daughter. None of these things exist or ever did exist in the past, though I know what they are. I can also conceive of many forms that do exist, like myself, a tree 10 feet from my window, and a bird perched in the tree. Since I am not merely conceiving of them, but actually perceiving them right now, I am not only able to apprehend what they are, their form or their essence, I'm also able to truly judge that they are, their existence. Every essence that I can conceive in my normal, everyday experience is in and of itself existentially neutral precisely because they are substances really composed of matter and form. Matter being the principle of change and diversity, form being the principle of persistence over time. These natural substances are genuinely potential as they may exist. That is to say, they may very well not exist like Darth Vader. And if they do exist, like the tree in front of me, they do so with the potential to become other than what they are. Again, these contingent essences, precisely because they are contingent, may or may not exist. This existential neutrality is true not only of mere potentials like Darth Vader, but also of any currently existing contingent beings. Existentially neutral Darth Vader does not exist. Existentially neutral tree in front of my window does exist. Both propositions are true, and what distinguishes Darth Vader from the tree in front of me is that Vader has not, while the tree has, been united to existence. The heart of the Thomistic metaphysic, then, is that within every currently existing contingent being, there is a real distinction between essence and existence, between whatness and thatness. The question, then, is why do contingent essences exist when they do not need to? The answer is found in the next premise, which is to say, premise 2. Whatever is contingent is currently being caused to exist by another. A cause is that which produces an effect, or that which reduces a potentiality to actuality. According to Aristotle, the concept of causation can be parsed into 4 different kinds of causality: efficient, formal, material, and final, with exemplar and instrumental causes added by the medieval scholastics. While we affirm this analysis, our main concern here is with efficient causality. Our contention is that for every really existent contingent being, its potential for existence is continually being reduced to actuality by at least one efficient cause. While we may offer several arguments for our premise, here we offer only one. We're calling it the argument from existential neutrality to causality. As an illustration, consider swimming pools. As such, a swimming pool is indifferent as to whether or not it contains water. I know this because of experience. Some pools are filled with water, while others are not. In fact, I'm aware of some swimming pools that have had no water, only to be filled with water the very next day. What explains this? The answer is that the pool became filled by something other than itself, which is to say, something caused it to be filled with water. Furthermore, the water in the pool is indifferent as to its temperature, for it can become either hot or cold. The explanation for why the water is hot or why the water is cold is found in something outside of itself. For example, the sun, which makes it hot, or freezing weather, which makes it cold. These examples illustrate a principle, and the principle is this: whatever is indifferent with respect to a particular condition or state of affairs and one condition or state of affairs obtains rather than another, the obtaining of the one rather than the other is due to a cause. Now, in and of itself, the essence of a contingent being is existentially neutral. And so the obtaining of every contingent thing's existence is due to a cause. As Thomas Aquinas himself says, everything that can be and not be has a cause, for considered in itself, it is indifferent to either, so that something else must exist which determines it to exist. And that leads us to premise 3. There are at least two beings that exist on a cause and effect relationship. This premise necessarily follows from the first two premises. For if even only one contingent thing exists, and if any and every contingent thing is caused to exist by another, then there are at least two things in existence simultaneously related to one another as effect and concurrent cause. If, however, we conclude that there are only two things in existence, an effect or contingent being and its cause, then we must grant the existence of at least one uncaused cause, which just is the conclusion of stage 2 of our overall argument. For if the cause of the effect is itself contingent, then it too is caused by another. Now, the critics of our argument, of course, do not want, they want to avoid the conclusion that there is an uncaused cause. Their only option at this point is to say that the contingent things we observe are caused by yet other contingent things. And this gives us a series of causes. However, the series we are talking about is not a horizontal temporal series where each contingent event follows another contingent event in time. Rather, the series is a vertical, simultaneous series wherein each contingent being is caused to exist by other beings or other contingent beings right now in the present moment. The all-important distinction between horizontal and vertical series of cause-effect relations just is the difference between what the medieval scholastics refer to as an accidentally ordered series of causes and effects, a per accident series, and an essentially ordered series of causes and effects, a per se series. In an accidental series, the cause-effect relationship is one-to-one. That is to say, one cause or causal event to one effect or group of effects. In a per accident series, events are causally connected in a moment of time, but do not remain as such as time moves forward. For example, the temporal series of causes, from grandfather to father to me, exist along a timeline wherein once the effect is produced, the cause is no longer needed for the effect to continue existing. And that is illustrated by the fact that I barely knew my grandfather, and I can continue living upon my father's demise. Now, an essentially ordered series or a per se series is different, for it concerns cause and effect relationships that are one-to-many, ongoing,
1 minute.
and so simultaneous. And if perchance one of the causes in the chain of cause-effect relations were to cease its causal activity, then its effects would no longer continue in existence. The most common illustration going back to Aquinas is of a man's mind which moves his hand, that moves a stick, to cause it to roll. And Ryan, we agreed that our speakers could divvy up the speeches any way we pleased. So I'm going to finish this whole 25-minute speech, if that's okay with you.
All right, as long as that's all good by Dr. Howe, as long as that, yeah, sure. Let's continue on
Sure.
then. We'll just reset and carry forward.
Okay, so just to repeat, and you can take away from my time for this, an essentially ordered series concerns cause and effect relationships that are one-to-many, ongoing, and simultaneous. And if perchance one of the causes in the chain of cause-effect relations were to cease its causal activity, then its effects would no longer continue in existence. The most common illustration that goes all the way back to Thomas Aquinas himself is of a man's mind which moves his hand, that moves a stick, to move a stone, to cause it to roll. Now notice that here, in a per se series, the causal relationship is one-to-many, as causality is distributed to every member of the series. In such a series, the cause-effect relationship between any two members, like the hand moving the stick, is in and of itself an insufficient explanation for the movement of the effect, like the stone, at least until the series of causes and effects terminates in the mind that moves the hand, that moves the stick, that moves the stone. Hypothetically, if the mind is itself moved by another, then that state of affairs entails that there is at least one more member of the per se chain of efficient causes. If you kill the father in a per accident series, then the offspring may still reproduce. You remove the hand in a per se series, and the stone stops moving. That leads us to premise 4. An infinite regress of contingent causes and effects is impossible. In establishing a cause-effect relationship between a contingent thing and its cause, we have automatically admitted a series of contingent cause-effect relationships in reality. Now, as we saw in premises 2 through 3, the series we are talking about is per se and not per accidents. Our contention is that at least one cause must exist to sustain the series of contingent effects. There are multiple reasons to affirm this premise. Here we offer 2. First, in the nature of the case, while a per accident series may extend infinitely into the past and infinitely into the future, so that there is no first or even last member of the series, the number of members of a per se series must be finite, as it must terminate in a cause that distributes causality throughout its contingent effects. And so the per se series of contingent effects must terminate in a cause that is not a part of the series. Second of all, even if we were wrong about our first point, and the per se series is infinite, we must conclude that there is a cause of the whole series. For if every member of the series is contingent, then the per se series itself cannot be uncaused. As Copleston said to Russell in their famous debate on God's existence, add chocolates to infinity, and you don't wind up with a sheep. Similarly, add contingent beings to infinity, and you still get contingent beings. This logically entails the contingency of the whole per se series, and since the series is itself contingent, then it therefore follows that there is at least one cause of the sum total of contingent causes and effects. And that concludes stage 1 of our argumentation. Premise number 6. The cause of the series of contingent causes and effects cannot itself be contingent. In other words, the cause of the whole per se series cannot be caused to exist by another, for then it would not be the cause of the whole series. It would simply be a part of the series, and that's a point that contradicts our established conclusion. Premise 7. The cause of the series of contingent causes and effects cannot be self-caused, and that too is evident because nothing can be ontologically prior to itself. And that leads us to premise 8. The cause of the series of contingent causes and effects is uncaused. Whatever exists is either caused or self-caused or uncaused, but the cause of a really existent per se series of causes and effects cannot itself be caused or self-caused, and therefore it must be uncaused, and that leads to our conclusion: at least one uncaused cause exists, and that completes stage 2 of our argumentation. Premise 10. The uncaused cause is necessary or timelessly eternal, absolute or ultimate, immutable, infinite, self-existent or independent, impassible, immaterial, perfect, transcendent, and one, or unique and simple. The uncaused cause is omnipotent, omnipresent, or immense, omniscient, which is to say, truth, mind, logic, and wisdom. Omnibenevolent, which is to say, volition, justice, love, joy, light, beauty, and perfection. And purely spiritual, which is to say, incorporeal, personal, paternal, immanent, and relational. He is apprehensible and yet incomprehensible. Now, what can we say in favor of this premise? Well, there are only 2 modalities, contingent and necessary. And since we know that the uncaused cause cannot be contingent, it must be necessary. If this necessary being were correlative with the contingent order, and so changing, finite, and dependent, then it would not be necessary but contingent, and therefore the uncaused cause must be absolute, immutable, infinite, and self-existent. As such, it cannot have come into existence, and since it is immutable, its eternity must be wholly without succession. As a wholly immutable being that experiences no succession, the uncaused cause cannot suffer the vicissitudes of this present life we experience, and so must be impassible. As the cause of all material reality, the uncaused cause must be immaterial or pure form. And since the uncaused cause does not suffer change, succession, limitations, or bodily harm or stress, it must be transcendent with respect to the natural order. The uncaused cause is either merely potential, composed of actuality and passive potentiality, or is pure actuality. But the uncaused cause exists, and so is not merely potential. And the uncaused cause cannot be composed of actuality and potentiality, for then it would be contingent. And so the uncaused cause is pure actuality, or more simply, pure act. As immaterial, the uncaused cause is a pure form, which, because it is not composed with matter, cannot be differentiated. As pure act, there is no potential within its being for change or non-existence or even diversity. And so not only are there no accidental properties within its nature, because all of its attributes are essential, the qualities inhering within the uncaused cause admit of no real distinctions. In other words, the uncaused cause is a unity of singularity, which is to say, there is only one uncaused cause. And the uncaused cause is a unity of simplicity, which is to say, there is no distinction within the uncaused cause of matter and form, because it is pure form, of actuality and potentiality, because it is pure act, of essence and existence, because it is pure existence, or better still, pure esse. Whatever is in the uncaused cause just is the uncaused cause. Now, pure act has at least some power, as it is able to sustain the contingent order, but there are no limitations to its attributes, and therefore pure act is infinite in its power. It is omnipotent. Existence entails location, and so the uncaused cause exists somewhere, but its infinitude entails that it exists everywhere. And its simplicity entails that it is immense with respect to its presence. Given pure act's temporality, it is best to say that all is present to pure act in such a way that as their efficient cause, every contingent being exists in the one that is pure esse. As knowledge is power, pure act must be all-knowing, and thereby being an infinitely wise and purely logical mind, comprehending all truth in one eternal act of intuition. Between two options, the occurrence of which is in and of itself completely indifferent, the obtaining of one rather than another is the result of choice or agent causality rather than state-to-state or event causation. For example, a flipped coin landing heads or tails is determined through air pressure, rotation speed, gravitation, and so forth, and so is the result of event causality. However, whether or not the coin is flipped in the first place is indifferent as to its occurrence, and so is the result of choice. Similarly, whether or not a contingent world exists is completely indifferent, as contingent beings are in and of themselves existentially neutral. And there's nothing independent of the uncaused cause that can force or even bias it to cause the contingent order to obtain. And so the uncaused cause sustains this contingent order because it freely chooses to do so. To exist is an intrinsic good. Therefore, by bestowing existence on contingent creatures, the uncaused cause is freely willing their good, which just is a manifestation of love. And as love is an emotion, the uncaused cause must be emotional, and yet as impassible, pure act's emotions cannot be determined by anything within the contingent order. In short, pure act is pure love. And as pure love, pure act is pure joy. The simpler a being is, the more beautiful. Pure act is absolutely simple, and as pure love and joy, pure act is absolutely beautiful. Pure esse, then, is completely perfect. All of this indicates that no evil can exist within the necessary being. Indeed, insofar as darkness and light are metaphors for evil and good respectively, the uncaused cause is pure light, wherein no darkness resides. For evil is the lack or privation or deficiency of a good that is owed, but the one that is pure act cannot possess any deficiencies, and therefore the uncaused cause must be all good, and as a free will that always loves and chooses the good, pure act is omnibenevolent. As such, pure act is not only pure love, but perfect justice. As a pure mind of goodwill and love, pure act is personal rather than impersonal, and so pure act is a he rather than an it. Pure esse is not merely an immaterial being,
1 minute.
but a pure spirit who cares for us as a father cares for his children through his sustaining activity. He is immanent with respect to the natural order, which indicates a genuine concern over the world he sustains. As such, he relates to all of us, not in the sense that he is ordered to us, but in the sense that we are all ordered to him. In the words of Epimenides, in him we live and move and have our being. If this argument proves anything, it proves that we can know that pure act exists and even a little of what he is like. And yet, though we can apprehend him with our reason, he transcends our sensations and therefore is incomprehensible. And that leads us to premise 11. The uncaused cause just is everything classical Thomistic theists believe their God to be. All of the qualities or attributes that Thomas predicated upon his God are predicated upon the uncaused cause. As the Reformed tradition states in one of its catechisms,
That's time.
God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth, and therefore the God of classical Thomistic theism exists. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Campbell. Travis Campbell, thank you so much for coming to Modern Day Debate and for your introductory statement. It's a pleasure to have you here. And also, you haven't heard from him yet, but you'll hear from him in a little bit. Richard G. Howe. Dr. Howe is an international teacher, writer, public speaker, and debater in churches, conferences, and university campuses on issues concerning Christian apologetics and philosophy. He is Norman L. Geisler Chair of Christian Apologetics at Southern Evangelical Seminary in Rock Hill, South Carolina, where he also serves as professor of philosophy and apologetics and as the provost. Dr. Howe is I may have said that wrong, sorry. Dr. Howe is past president of the International Society of Christian Apologetics. In his free time, Richard and his wife, Rebecca, enjoy international travel. So we'll get to hear from you in a little bit here, Dr. Howe. We're going to hand the ball over to the other side. So Ben Watkins, I'll tell you a little bit about Ben here, and we'll get right to it. Ben was raised as a Christian in a Quaker-like faith in the deep south of South Carolina. Oh, we have a screen share, so I'll transfer over to that right quick, and I'll carry on. So in the deep south of South Carolina, though he is currently an atheist, his undergraduate degree is in mechanical engineering from the University of South Carolina, and he currently resides in Norfolk, Virginia, where he works as a nuclear engineer for the Department of Defense. Though he no longer considers himself a believer, he still finds great value in studying, discussing, and reflecting on deep questions about God, religion, and the reasons for belief about both. Ben's commitment is to pursuing truth for its own sake and making an effort to engage with theists charitably and with their strongest beliefs. Ben has conducted debates with leading apologists such as Father Gregory Pine and Trent Horn. So without further ado, we'll hand it over to you, Ben Watkins. The floor is all yours.
All right, everyone can see my screen and hear me all right.
We sure can.
All right, so let me begin by thanking Dr. Howe and Dr. Campbell for having this discussion with us today. So in a few moments, my good friend and real atheology colleague, Ben Bavar, will defend the contention there are no good reasons to accept classical theism. We will see how philosophical methods like deductive proofs, while sufficient for mathematics and logic, are an inadequate means for understanding what the world is like. Instead, we will need to turn to philosophical methods more or less continuous with science. For the moment, it will be my task to defend the contention that there are good reasons to reject classical theism. And I begin with the methodological assumption that knowing what the world is like, independent of mere human imagination, involves our experience of the world and our explanatory theorizing about it. We can model this methodology using an abductive schema from the philosopher of science, C.S. Peirce. Let E be some observation or fact of experience, and H a hypothesis with the best balance of theoretical simplicity and explanatory power regarding E. My aim will be to compare classical theism with a plausible alternative and argue that classical theism is probably false, other things being equal. This approach will be essentially comparative. Some fact E is surprising given H1 and a matter of course given an alternative hypothesis H2. Hence, there is good reason to suspect H1 is false. We can modify Peirce's schema to reflect this comparative approach, but what is meant by surprising, a matter of course, and a good reason? A good reason is one given by a conclusion that is true, or at least probably true. Modifying Peirce's schema again, we can understand the terms surprising and a matter of course in similar probabilistic terms, and let H1 be classical theism and H2 be metaphysical naturalism. Naturalism is the hypothesis that causal reality is fundamentally impersonal and indifferent to the nature and condition of sentient life, and any actual minds are late and local physical products of mindless chance processes, like cosmic and biological evolution. Recall, my aim is to compare the theoretical simplicity and explanatory power of two logically incompatible hypotheses, classical theism and naturalism. So let's consider theoretical simplicity first. Classical theism is not more probable intrinsically than metaphysical naturalism. That is, the probability of H independent of E, because naturalism is both more modest and more coherent than classical theism. Modesty is a measure of how much H asserts prior to considering E, and classical theism asserts much more than naturalism. All plausible worldviews share a commitment to the natural causal order, making it a fundamental subset of any plausible hypothesis. But the ontological commitments of classical theism extend well beyond the natural world. Classical theism is committed to a supernatural causal reality over and above the natural causal order. Additionally, classical theism has more metaphysical commitments than naturalism, like Aristotelian causation, agent causality, the privation theory of evil, and the notorious doctrine of divine simplicity. In addition to being additional metaphysical commitments, these features of classical theism create problems of coherence too. Coherence is a measure of how well the pieces of H logically fit together prior to considering E. For example, like many dissenters of Protestant persuasion, I have never been able to make any coherent sense of the doctrine of divine simplicity. The claim that God's mentality is a timeless simplicity, lacking any parts, rather than a temporal complexity of distinct mental states. David Hume expresses a similar bewilderment in his dialogues concerning natural religion. Hume goes on to say, "For though it be allowed that the deity possesses attributes of which we have no comprehension, yet ought we never to ascribe to him any attributes which are absolutely incompatible with that intelligent nature essential to him. Thought is fluctuating, uncertain, fleeting, successive, and compounded, and were we to remove these circumstances, we absolutely annihilate its essence, and it would in such a case be an abuse of terms to apply it to the name of thought or reason. A mind whose acts and sentiments are not distinct and successive, one that is wholly simple and wholly immutable, is a mind which has no thought, no reason, no will, no sentiment, no love, no hatred, or in a word, is no mind at all. It is an abuse of terms to give it that appellation, and we may as well speak of limited extension without figure or of number without composition. As it stands, this is not much of an argument, but rather it is a vague, inchoate dissatisfaction that should prompt us to formulate an argument. So I will give at least two here. According to the doctrine of divine simplicity, God's omnipotent will is identical to his essence and existence across all possible worlds, because it is purely actual, and whatever is purely actual lacks the potential to be otherwise. Whatever lacks the potential to be otherwise is necessary. Therefore, God's omnipotent will is necessary. However, according to God's agent causality, God's omnipotent will could have been otherwise. That is, God could have freely chosen to create nothing rather than something, or something else entirely. Therefore, God's omnipotent will is contingent. Obviously, God's will cannot be both necessary and contingent, but Dr. Howe and Dr. Campbell affirmed both the doctrine of divine simplicity and God's agent causality. And as we just saw, the former implies God's will is necessary, while the latter implies it is contingent. My point here is that these pieces of classical theism do not coherently fit well together. Let's call this the argument from freedom. God's agent causality and the doctrine of divine simplicity also raise problems of coherence for God's cognition in addition to his agency. According to the doctrine of divine simplicity, God's omniscient knowledge is identical to his essence and existence across all possible worlds. So God's beliefs are the same across all possible worlds. That is, they are necessary. However, according to God's agent causality, God exists alone in some possible world. That is, he could have created nothing rather than something. So God's belief that nothing else existed is contingent. However, God's belief that nothing else exists cannot be both necessary and contingent. And Dr. Howe and Dr. Campbell's model of God include both the doctrine of divine simplicity and God's agent causality. So again, these pieces do not coherently fit well together. Following Dr. Ryan Mullins and Joe Schmid, let's call this the aloneness argument. All parties to this discussion can concede that classical theism is less modest than naturalism, as it posits a causal reality over and above the natural world, and has more metaphysical commitments than naturalism. All parties to this discussion can also concede that classical theism faces prima facie problems of coherence, as its pieces do not fit well together, like the doctrine of divine simplicity and God's agent causality. However, for the sake of argument, let us concede to Dr. Howe and Dr. Campbell that classical theism is, in fact, more probable intrinsically than naturalism. In light of the previous considerations about modesty and coherence, all parties to this discussion can concede classical theism is not much more probable intrinsically than naturalism. That is, naturalism is at least a plausible alternative hypothesis. Allowing for this concession, we can modify Peirce's scheme a final time. Having considered theoretical simplicity, let us now consider explanatory power. This will require me to say something about E and its relationship to H1 and H2. According to what Ian Hacking and Elliot Sober have called the law of likelihood, given a surprising fact E, we have reason to reject H1 and suspect H2 is true instead if the likelihood of E given H2 is greater than the likelihood of E given H1. My next two arguments will claim that E is much more likely given naturalism than classical theism. But first, what is E in these cases? My first empirical argument is the well-worn argument from evil, formulated notably by Paul Draper. Let E be observed facts regarding human and non-human animal suffering. An infinitely loving person prevents or eliminates as much suffering as they properly can. But the actual world contains a wide variety of evils, like depression, dread, and non-human animal pain in the course of biological evolution, that an infinitely powerful person could properly prevent. Hence, known facts about suffering are very surprising, given classical theism. By contrast, mindless chance processes, like those involved in the course of cosmic and biological evolution, are entirely indifferent to the nature and condition of sentient life. So known facts about suffering are a matter of course, given metaphysical naturalism. Therefore, facts about human and non-human suffering are much more likely given naturalism than classical theism. My second empirical argument is what J.L. Schellenberg has dubbed the argument from divine hiddenness, or the hiddenness argument for short. Let E be observed facts about non-resistant non-theists. That is, people who come to no longer believe or never have believed God exists. And this lack of belief is not the result of behavioral or emotional opposition towards a relationship.
30 seconds.
Non-resistant non-theists are very surprising given classical theism because God's perfect love involves ensuring the necessary conditions for personal relationships. And a belief that God exists is a necessary condition for a personal relationship. We cannot have a personal relationship with God unless we also believe that God exists. The presence of God, that is his openness to a relationship, would be like a light that may fluctuate in brightness but always remained on unless we were to resist it by closing our eyes. By contrast, an impersonal and mindless natural order is entirely indifferent to the content of our theological beliefs. So non-resistant non-theists are a matter of course, given naturalism. Therefore, facts about non-resistant non-theists are much more likely given naturalism than classical theism.
All right.
In my opening statement,
oh, sorry. Go ahead. I thought you might be finished up there. Are you Did you guys also plan on continuing on your side, Watkins, or did you want to hand it over? It's been 12 minutes now.
I was going to read this last paragraph, and then Ben
Oh,
Bavar was going to.
go right ahead then. Sorry to cut you off.
In my opening statement, I argued for my main contention that there are good reasons to reject classical theism by comparing it with a logically incompatible naturalistic alternative that has a better balance of theoretical simplicity and explanatory power. So classical theism cannot be more probable than naturalism, other things being equal. In closing, I'd like to note that my conclusion is not that naturalism is true, nor even that it is probably true. Rather, my conclusion is that classical theism is probably false, other things being equal. Additionally, I have appealed only to premises that all parties to this discussion can readily concede. My conclusion does not depend on any contentious metaphysical nor epistemological assumptions like Dr. Howe and Dr. Campbell's Thomistic argument does. In critiquing their argument further, let me turn things over to Ben Bavar, who will defend the contention there are no good reasons to accept classical theism. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much there, Ben Watkins, for your opening statement. So I have a little extra here. So Ben Watkins and Ben Bavar are also part of the Real Atheology team. So that was founded in 2015. Real Atheology is a project aimed at encouraging a more philosophical, attentive approach to the popular level discourse between atheists and theists. To that end, the team at RA draws on insights and arguments found within contemporary analytic philosophy of religion and related fields. Those insights and arguments are then explored in interviews, public debates, videos, and blog posts, while the individuals upon whom the RA team ontologically depends are atheologically inclined. Not all of those whose insights they value are. Boy, I had to read that a few times earlier. So, with more specific, here we have Ben Bavar was raised as a Baptist and a young earth creationist in St. Joseph County, Indiana, known for the University of Notre Dame. After hearing of a close family member's deconversion, he began to investigate the defenses of the Christian faith that were available. Eventually finding these apologetics to be inadequate, he lost his own faith, becoming a non-theist. He has since remained a non-theist, but his worldview continues to evolve. He was the president of the Philosophy of Religion Club at his alma mater at the University of Pittsburgh, where he received a bachelor's in philosophy. So, without further ado, over to Ben Bavar, and thank you so much for coming out to Modern Day Debate.
Oh. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Ben, for handing it over to me. Thank you as well, Travis and Richard, for speaking with us tonight. All right, looks like we have the slides ready. Ben and I agree with you that some contingent being exists, but it is doubtful that each contingent thing is currently being caused to exist by another. A full swimming pool was caused by another to be filled with water back when it was filled up, but it is no longer being caused to be full. It has simply remained full. And the reason it is full now is that someone or something put water in it back then. Likewise, a developing embryo was caused to exist when it was conceived, but it is no longer being caused to exist. It has just kept on existing. That's not to say there's no reason it exists now, just that the reason is that it was conceived back then. Dr. Campbell and Dr. Howe presuppose a principle of sufficient reason in their argument from existential neutrality to causality. They say that since a contingent thing's nature in no way disposes it to exist or not exist, something beyond the contingent thing must explain why it exists rather than not existing. But that only follows if there must be contrastive explanations of the existence of contingent things. That is, explanations as to why they exist instead of not existing. Of course, there are reasons swimming pools are full rather than empty and hot rather than cold, but that does not mean every contingent thing in the world exists for a reason. A separate question, interesting in its own right, is whether there are such things as vertical and per se causal series. What we are interested in is not any old case of simultaneous or sustaining causation, but rather a case in which contingent beings are caused to exist. And what we really mean by being here, I believe, is a substance, something that just is, not something that happens like an event. Rather, things happen to it as it endures through time. A series of contingent beings causing other contingent beings to exist is what I call a series of existence actualizers, rather than a series of action actualizers. By this, I mean it involves things actualizing substances' potentials for existence, not their potentials for action. To actualize a potential for action is to induce a change in a substance that already exists. To actualize a potential for existence, on the other hand, is to make a substance exist. For simplicity, let's call action actualizers movers and existence actualizers makers. Travis and Richard offer an example of a vertical per se series, but unfortunately, it is a series of movers, not makers. A man's mind or brain moves his hand that moves a stick that moves a stone. The substances are merely caused to change position, not to exist. The brain may not change position like the rest, but parts of the brain do in order to move the hand. Presumably, something outside the brain moves those parts, and something else moves what moves the parts of the brain, and so on. But somewhere down the line, we likely reach a cause temporally prior to the supposedly simultaneous causes. If that's right, a per accident series explains the per se series. If anything, the stone rolling case requires an unmoved mover, not an unmade maker. Now, even if the case of the man's pushing the rock does not involve an unmade maker, one might argue it involves vertical causation. But in fact, it does not. Vertical causation is by definition instantaneous. The causing happens within a single instant. But the man's pushing the rock is not instantaneous. If only one moment ever occurred, and in that moment there were a man with his hand wrapped around a stick touching a stone, nothing would ever move. Nothing would have time to change position. So, a fortiori, nothing would cause anything to move. Causal relata, that is, causes and effects, are events, and causes temporally precede their effects. While we do colloquially say that the stick moves the stone and even that it causes the stone to move, the stick is not the cause of the stone's motion. If it were, then its mere existence would make the stone move. But it does not. The stick has to do something to move the stone, and its doing that thing is an event. Since we must appeal to this event to fully answer the question, why does the stone move? The event is the cause, not the stick. Since there can be no causal series without at least two events, one prior to the other, and even one event tends to last longer than an instant, we should expect every causal series to be spread out over time. When the stick first pressed against the stone was not yet moving. It began moving immediately after. Though the stick keeps pressing against it, that's not why the stone is moving now. It's moving because of the pressure the stick applied to it before. The present pressure will keep the stone moving later. Since the prior pressure fully explains the stone's rolling now, any further cause of the stone's presently rolling would be redundant. Whenever a horizontal cause suffices for an effect, we should not posit a vertical cause. Such overdetermination is unparsimonious, if not impossible. Despite all these arguments to the contrary, Suppose the man's pushing the rock does involve concurrent causation. If there are concurrent movers, maybe, just maybe, there are concurrent makers. But it would be rather bold to claim that all contingent objects have concurrent makers. Even if they are all caused to exist, that's not to say something is actively keeping them in existence as long as they're around. They might have prior makers instead, forming a per accident series, which could stretch infinitely into the past, never terminating in an unmade maker. The best argument that they all have concurrent makers is that all contingent things are made of parts, whose existence and unity sustain them at every moment. For example, as I recall, Ed Fazer says the coffee in a cup is being actualized right now, partly by the water molecules that make up the majority of it. Those molecules are in turn being actualized by the hydrogen and oxygen atoms that compose them, which are in turn being actualized by electrons and quarks. Take away the electrons and quarks, and you have no coffee. So Fazer identifies this as a per se causal series. I should mention in passing that things might depend on their parts without being caused by them. Just because the coffee would not exist if the water were not currently composing it does not mean the water is currently causing the coffee to exist. But let's assume it is for the sake of argument. There's nothing special about coffee. If coffee is concurrently actualized by its parts, so is any composite contingent thing. This leaves us with a few alternatives. Either there is a beginningless series of composed composers, or there are uncomposed composers. If there are uncomposed composers, these are either uncaused altogether or caused by non-parts. Conceivably, matter is infinitely divisible, comprising a hierarchy of ever smaller parts. But Travis and Richard would deny the possibility of such a beginningless causal hierarchy. They point out that in the case of the man's propelling the stone forward, the stick would not move the stone if it weren't for the man. Likewise, they would say the water molecules would not partly compose the coffee if it weren't for those molecules' most basic constituents. But this would be a misguided inference. All that follows from the nature of a per se series is any given member depends for its causal power on all the prior members. So if a per se series happens to have a beginning, like in the stone rolling case, the causal power ultimately derives from the first member. But if it lacks a beginning, any given member derives its causal power from the infinitely many prior members. There is no need for each member's power to trace back to an uncaused cause. Nor does the whole series require a cause. If there is such a thing as the whole series, it is contingent and so dependent, but not necessarily caused. But suppose it does need a cause. It still does not need a sustainer like its individual members do. An event prior to the series would suffice to bring it about. In other words, the per se series may have a per accidents cause. And this cause could even be contingent, because that would not make it a member of the per se series. Only per se causes are members. But suppose the cause is necessary. Still, rather than being uncaused, it might have a necessarily existent cause of its own, which might have yet another cause, and so on. A beginningless series of composers is merely a metaphysical possibility. According to contemporary theoretical physics, electrons and quarks are not composed of other particles. For this reason, physicists call them elementary particles. But if they're not made of particles, they lack physical parts. So, unless they have non-physical parts or their causes are not parts of them, they lack concurrent actualizers. But that does not entail they are unmade makers, as they might have been caused by events that occurred just before they began to exist. This is how pair production works. I have a paragraph.
Cool.
I'm fine with him finishing as long
Yeah.
as everybody else is. So let him go ahead.
Sorry
and
about that.
finish his
Sure.
point. No,
Yeah.
Let's carry
we
on.
I
all
was
went
rushing
over
about that.
so far, so
Yeah.
we've all
Yeah.
committed this sin. So
Yeah,
you're,
come
you're
on.
good.
No worries. Last
Okay, I'm
paragraph. Let's go
excused.
for it.
Thank you.
It's okay.
Okay. Uh, so when a photon approaches a heavy nucleus in pair production, the photon's energy is converted to mass, giving rise to both an electron and a positron. First, the photon approaches the nucleus, and then an electron comes into being. The photon and nucleus actualize the electron's potential for existence, but once the electron is there, the photon is gone, having been replaced by the electron and positron. The electron can easily leave the site of its creation as well, so its existence does not depend on the ongoing action of the photon or the nucleus. The particles form a horizontal per accidents causal series. Okay, one more slide.
No worries.
If elementary particles lie at the foundation of every hierarchy of parts, and all elementary particles come from beginningless per accident series, there is no need for an unmade maker. Dr. Campbell and Dr. Howe assert that all material substances, including elementary particles, are composed of matter and form, but we have seen no argument for this. By Occam's razor, we can safely assume elementary particles have no parts. And with that, I conclude my response to the first two stages of our interlocutor's argument.
All right. Well, thank you to all of our speakers for your introductory statements. We are going to, well, I know that there was some objection. We wanted to go right into our open discussion, but I think what we should do is potentially just give it to up to you guys to cede the floor to the other side, and we can still do up to maybe like say 6 minutes, because I think it'd be good to get Richard in here and hear some of your thoughts on what we're hearing there. So yeah, before we go right into that open discussion, I know you guys were all jonesing to get to it. Let's go on.
Actually, we did want to do the 12-minute responses. I mean, and then go into the open discussion.
Oh, see, I interpret that as we're jonesing to get right to that open discussion.
Oh, no,
That's fine.
no.
All right, that's okay. All right, well then we'll do up to 12 then. Yeah, no objections over here. That's for sure. So, but yeah, still fair. Yeah, Richard, if you want to jump on in here and give us your thoughts so far on the discussion, what you're hearing, and some of maybe some counterpoints you might want to present. So, thank you so much for being here. Hit the like button, everybody, if you haven't already, and let's go up to 12 minutes here, and over to you, Richard.
So before you start my time, if I may just make an editorial comment, because I'm going to try to cram as much as I am in 12 minutes, some of my comments may come across brusque in their style. I don't mean it that way, but that's just a concession to the constraints of time. So thank you.
No worries.
So in a moment, I should like to make a few points on metaphysics, primarily in response to Ben Bavar's part of the opening. With respect to Ben Watkins' part, I'll mention 2 bullet points in anticipation of a fuller discussion of them in our conversation in Q&A to follow if the need arises. First, the 2 bullet points on Ben Watkins. First, regarding the abductive method. While we grant a level of usefulness of the abductive method in adjudicating rival scientific, forensic, or historical, etc. hypotheses, we reject the abductive method as a way of adjudicating philosophical, that is to say, metaphysical claims. Abductive procedures take into consideration one's background knowledge in constructing an argument to the best explanation, weighing various probabilities, will result in a vicious circular reasoning, since what constitutes one's background knowledge, or how one might evaluate an argument to the best explanation, or weigh an idea's probability, will be determined by their metaphysics in the first place. Would it even make sense to say that Aristotle's position of immanent forms is more probable than Plato's transcendent forms? And even if we were moved to embrace abduction as a primary method, we find lots of facts, no less than 8, that are surprising on naturalism, but not on theism. Second, we find Watkins' internal critique to be unsound, as Thomas's metaphysics provides all the resources necessary to handle the arguments from freedom and aloneness. 2 issues are involved here. One, whether, given his metaphysics, Aquinas' treatment of these issues is successful, and 2, whether Aquinas' metaphysics is true. Now on to Ben Bavar. First, current causality of contingent beings. Ben says, quote, a full swimming pool was caused by another to be filled with water back when it was filled up, but it is no longer being caused to be full, unquote. Here he's seeking to show that there's no need to have a continuing cause or reason of every given state of affairs. This undoubtedly is an assertion of existential inertia and perhaps a subtle reference to the principle of sufficient reasons, both of which we may explore in more depth a little later. But in response, let me say the problem here is that Ben has given an analogy from the pool and water, borrowing as he did from Travis, but he's applying it to pick out a different philosophical or metaphysical point than the one we're making. Regardless of what needs to be said about whether and how the pool needs to be continually caused to be full, it is evident, to highlight a different aspect of the water in the pool, that the pool is continually causing the water in the pool to retain the shape of the pool itself. Remove the pool, and the water is no longer the shape of the pool. This is closer to what we are saying regarding existence. Anything whose essence is not existence itself only has existence. The shape is part of the nature of the pool, but it is only an accident of the water. Existence cannot be an accident of the thing in the classical understanding of accident, that is, within Aristotle's 10 categories. Given that existence is neither the essence nor an accident of the essence, it remains that existence is the actualization of the essence along the contours of act potency metaphysics. As such, it is being caused to exist by something whose essence is existence itself. I will revisit this line of thinking in due course. Second, whether there are per se causal series. Ben says, quote, what we are interested in is not any old case of simultaneous or sustaining causation, but rather a case in which contingent beings are caused to exist. And what we really mean by being here, I believe, is a substance, something that just is, not something that happens like an event, unquote. In response, first, he illicitly defines being as a substance, but this ignores important elements of the metaphysics underlying the classical theism Travis and I are defending. Aristotle's 10 categories list 10 ways in which a sensible object can be, namely such substance and at least 9 predicates or accidents of substance: quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, state or habitus, action, and passion. To this, Aquinas adds, beyond Aristotle, the last rung of the ladder of the act potency schema, namely existence, since existence is to essence as act to potency. The problem here is that Ben seemingly thinks that actions have nothing to do with existence. He says, quote, a series of contingent beings causing other contingent beings to exist is what I call a series of existence actualizers, rather than a series of action actualizers, unquote. Trying to make a distinction between the actualization of existence and the actualization of actions exhibits a misunderstanding of the underlying metaphysics. Such a misunderstanding is made more evident when Ben says, quote, to actualize a potential for action is to induce a change in a substance that already exists. To actualize a potential for existence, on the other hand, is to make a substance exist, unquote. To be sure, actualizing the, quote, potential for action can only occur in a substance that already exists. This is exactly what it means to say that accidents inhere in substances, Plato notwithstanding. But in this context, to actualize is to make something exist. All actualizations are, in the end, actualizations of existence. That's what the term actualize means at this top level of the metaphysics. Because Ben thinks of existing things only as substances, he cannot see the difference between actualizing a substance and actualizing an accident or predicate of a substance, like, for example, the predicate of action in Aristotle's list of 10 categories. The actualization of a substance and the actualization of an accident of a substance are both actualizations of existence. The substance would have to exist before there could be any accidents of the substance, but the accident would have to exist if the accident, that it, for example, an action, is to be real. Only if an action of a substance has existence is the action real. But the existence of that accident is no less actualized than is the existence of the substance in which the accident inheres. Or to word the point in the direction of what the classical theist position is, the existence of the substance is no less actualized than is the existence of the accidents which inheres in the substance. Take, for example, a person who is jogging. The jogging of a jogger has existence. For example, existence or that is to say, existence as an accident of the substance. Approximately, the person is actualizing the accident of jogging. The jogging becomes real in the substance. The person as a substance also exists, but the person cannot actualize his own existence. Therefore, as an act, existence has to be continually caused in the substance for that substance to remain real. This can only be done by that whose essence is existence itself. In classical theism of the stripe Travis and I are defending, creation has existence. God is existence itself, ipsum esse subsistence.
Just to let
Second,
you know,
having introduced
you
this,
still got 4.5 minutes left. Sorry, just to jump in. Just to let you
Yeah,
guys
no
know,
worries.
just in case you had any ball to pass there, but I'll let you keep going there. If
Thanks.
that's fine by Travis.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Having said, second, having introduced this illicit position that only the accident of action has to be continually caused, but not the substance, Ben wrongly thinks he has grounds to dismiss the oft-touted illustration from Aquinas of per se causality and the hand moving the stick, moving the stone. Because Ben fails to see that the existence is the actualization of essence, whether that essence is the essence of a substance or the essence of an accident of the substance, he thinks there's no reason to apply the principle to any substance that the hand stick stone illustrates. In other words, Ben wrongly thinks he has grounds to dismiss the principle that a substance needs to be continually caused to exist if, indeed, that substance does not have the act of existing as part of its nature. And third, can a per accidents series explain a per se series? I should like to revisit Travis's illustration that might help clarify the distinction Aquinas is bringing out between an accidentally ordered causal series, per accidents for short, and a per se ordered causal series, per se for short. Consider the causal relationship between a man who sires a son, who then, as a man, goes on to sire a son. Man one sires son one, who grows up to become man two, who sires son two. Note that man one is the cause, if you will, of son one, and man two is the cause of son two. The key point to note here is that while man one causes his son to be a man, he does not cause his son to be a father. Thus, it is accidental to man one that his son goes on to sire a son. What is more, as a father, it is accidental to man two that he is the son of man one. He can be a father because he's a man, not because he's the son of another man. It will not do to insist that if man one did not have son one, and then son one could not go on to have his own son. While it is true that man two could not have his own son if man two did not exist, it's not necessary that he be the son of an earlier man. This is exactly the case, for example, with respect to Adam in the Bible. Adam could have a son without himself being the biological son of a previous man. The causal series is accidental, which is to say that being the son of a man is not metaphysically necessary condition for being a father. Now contrast this with a causal series of a line of interlocking turning gears. If you see a line of interlocking turning gears, you recognize two things. First, the turning is present throughout the entire line of interlocking turning gears. Regardless of whether the line of interlocking turning gears ever began to turn or have been turning from eternity past, it remains that the motion of turning is of the entire line. Notice, second, that there's nothing of the nature of gears that accounts for their turning. What is needed is something whose nature, if you will, is to turn. This is what we call a motor. Now, let me draw the contrast between the father and son on the one hand and the interlocking gears on the other. A man could be the cause of a son, even if that man was not the son of a prior man, as with Adam. He causes his son by virtue of being a man, not by virtue of being the son of another man. But a given gear is not only turning the gear following it, but the given gear is causing the gear following it to be a turner of the gear following it. In other words, remember, the man causes his son to be a man, but does not cause his son to be a father. Whereas the gear not only causes the next gear to turn, but it also causes the next gear to be a turner. An infinite series of gears could never explain the fact that all of them are turning. Only a motor explains that. All of this is to illustrate that the act of existing of anything that is existing can only be explained either, one, because the thing is being caused to exist as long as it is existing, as the gears are being caused to turn as long as they are turning. or two, because the existing thing is existing because it is of its nature to exist. But that whose nature is to exist, that is, that whose nature is the act of existing, is God. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much. You got 10 seconds there if you want to add anything, Travis, to the rebuttal now. Travis isn't feeling it right now. He's excited to hear what you have to say, Ben and Ben. So last Ben we heard from was Ben Bavar, but feel free to jump in here, either Ben, and let us know your thoughts. Over to you, Watkins.
There was
Okay.
quite a bit of critique of Ben Bavar's claims there, so I'm going to turn it over to Ben Bavar and let him. We'll jump in as that conversation evolves.
All right, I just paused the
Okay.
timer, so go ahead there, Ben Bavar.
Right. Okay. So actually, at the moment, I'm going to be addressing the third stage of your opening of Travis and Richard's opening because I didn't get around to that yet. So okay, let me get to that. So, one thing I'd like to address at the outset is they're taking it for granted that the uncaused cause is responsible for the contingent order and for all material reality. I concede that if the reasoning behind the first two stages of the argument succeeds, the uncaused cause is one of the causes of all contingent reality. And given that all material objects are composed of matter and form, and being composed of matter and form entails contingency, material reality has at least one immaterial cause by the logic of the first two stages. But there is no guarantee that any one uncaused cause underlying contingent reality plays a role in causing every single contingent thing, nor must the immaterial thing that takes part in causing material reality be the same uncaused cause stage 3 focuses on. Even a necessary uncaused cause could be changing, finite, and dependent. A thing that cannot fail to exist is necessary. So a finite thing that can change in respects other than whether it exists, but cannot cease to exist, is still necessary. Even if such a thing were to depend on other things for its existence, that would not mean it could fail to exist. For it to depend on them is for it to be such that it would not exist had they not existed. In other words, if they could fail to exist, it could fail to exist. But if they must exist, there's no reason it cannot exist necessarily as well. Suppose it were true that a necessary being could not be changing, finite, and dependent all at once. A necessary being could still have up to two of those three attributes, as long as it could do so without exemplifying the third. But suppose the uncaused cause were neither changing, nor finite, nor dependent. That would not entail it is immutable. Just because something never actually changes does not mean it cannot change. But even if the uncaused cause is immutable, it may have come into being. For a thing does not change when it comes into being. Before a thing comes into being, that thing is not around to undergo a change. You can say maybe the world changes when that thing comes into being, but the thing itself, I wouldn't say does. To change is to go from having one set of properties to having another. But when a thing begins existing, we cannot point to an earlier time at which that thing had the property of not existing, or had any set of properties distinct from those it has now. Things only have properties while they exist. To be immutable is not to be without succession. Just because a thing moves through time does not mean it changes. It would need to have distinct properties at distinct times to change. Of course, its properties would differ at different times if it had different emotions at different times. So an immutable being could not feel different at different times depending on the circumstances, but it could be passable in that it would not be the way it is had the past, present, or future differed. That is, the state of an immutable being could depend on everything that ever will have happened, even if the being does not change as things happen. This dependence does not require actual change, since the being state would only differ in a hypothetical alternate timeline. And even if, say, the immutable being would have felt different had different things occurred, that is not to say it would have failed to exist. So its feelings can depend on things beyond it, even if its existence does not. If there were no limits to the uncaused cause's attributes, it does seem that the uncaused cause's power would be infinite, particularly since it must have at least some power to cause a per se series. But if there are some attributes that the uncaused cause lacks altogether, it may be that the uncaused cause only possesses a certain kind of power to an infinite degree and lacks the other kinds altogether. Otherwise, we could argue the uncaused cause being unlimited must exemplify all attributes because it exemplifies at least one. But if that argument were available, it would obviate the need to infer all these divine attributes individually. The uncaused cause might exist without having a location. It is notoriously difficult to give informative definitions of terms like exist, is, and true. But suppose we can analyze the concept of existence in terms of more basic concepts. Even so, location is not one of those basic concepts, for there is no contradiction in the statement that unembodied minds or abstract objects, like numbers, exist without location. But of course, the uncaused cause cannot be an abstract object in the sense of something incapable of causing anything.
Halfway point right there.
Okay.
Continue if you'd like. It's up to Ben. Watkins,
Yeah, Ben W. How much longer can I go? Okay, I'll try to be fast.
You got this, man.
Okay.
All right, I'll pause it for a few seconds there to let you catch up. Continue on. Sorry about if I don't want to derail you, so let's just carry on.
No, that's okay. Okay. Our interlocutors said in their opening that a coin flip must be the result of choice rather than event causation. This is because the coin in and of itself lacks any bias in favor of being flipped or not being flipped. The coins landing heads or tails, on the other hand, can be determined by non-choice events, events that are not free choices. But the flip and its outcome are actually parallel in terms of bias if we assume the coin is fair. For the coin in itself lacks any bias in favor of landing heads or landing tails. It is those non-choice events, factors external to the coin, like air pressure and gravity, which bias the coin to land one way rather than the other. And if non-choice events can bias the coin to land heads, they can also bias it to be flipped, regardless of its lacking any bias in itself. For instance, an automated mechanical hand can flip the coin without choosing to do so. Neither the flip nor its outcome must result from a choice. But if either did, that choice would just be another event anyway. The same goes for the existence of contingent things. Even assuming they are indifferent between existing and non-existing, an external uncaused cause can bias them to exist. There are two ways this might work without a free choice on the part of the uncaused cause. One is that the uncaused cause in itself is biased to cause contingent things. The other is that something other than the uncaused cause biases it to cause contingent things. Dr. Campbell and Dr. Howe raise the latter possibility only to dismiss it. Why they dismiss it is beyond me, and hopefully they can clarify that when we open the floor for discussion. Suppose that existing is an intrinsic good, and that the uncaused cause freely bestows existence upon creatures. Nevertheless, the uncaused cause may not love creatures, even setting aside the issue of whether the uncaused cause knows existence is an intrinsic good. For regardless of whether the uncaused cause realizes existence is good, the uncaused cause may have malicious intent in causing contingent things to exist. Indeed, it may not will the good of creatures at all, except as a means to the end of harming them. for there is very little, if anything, the uncaused cause can do to harm a being that does not exist. So, if it wants to harm a being, it has no choice but to first benefit the being by conferring existence on it. But let's assume the uncaused cause wills the good of creatures. That it wills their good does not entail it has any emotions or feelings. Note that willing does not entail wanting. To will something is to be motivated to bring it about. But sometimes one is motivated to bring about things one does not want. For it is possible for one to see the value in things one does not personally desire. And this recognition of value is a belief rather than an emotion. So the uncaused cause may be utterly devoid of emotion, but still have goodwill. But this means the uncaused cause does not necessarily care for us as a father for his children. A good father does not only aim to promote his children's well-being, he is distraught when his children suffer. But for all we know, the uncaused cause aims to promote our well-being, but would not be upset were we to suffer. A good father is also willing to make great sacrifices for his children's sake. But for all we know, the uncaused cause is unwilling to make sacrifices for us. If it is infinite in power, it can offer us the gift of existence without inconveniencing itself. Let's grant for the sake of argument that the uncaused cause is loving, and that this means it is pure love. Even so, it may not be pure joy. Just because there is love in a being does not mean there is any joy in that being. In fact, love or goodwill frequently robs people of joy. The more one cares about another's well-being, the more one suffers when that other being suffers. But of course, if one is emotionally invested in another's well-being, one is delighted by their flourishing as well. The trouble is, creatures experience both flourishing and languishing. So, if anything, we should expect pure love to be a mix of joy and pain in relation to creaturely flourishing and languishing, respectively. Suppose the uncaused cause is a mind of goodwill and love. Does that mean the uncaused cause is a he rather than an it? That it is personal? It does not, because even an animal's mind could, in principle, be one of goodwill and love. Willing the good of another does not require the kind of intelligence and skills that set humans apart from animals.
10 seconds.
For this reason, we cannot classify, say, a mother chimpanzee as personal just because it cares for its babies enough to make sacrifices for them. Even a loving chimp is an it, though of course, if it is female, it is also normal to call it she to indicate its sex and perhaps personify it. Now, to be clear, I am not suggesting the uncaused cause might be an animal, just that it might be a mind of the impersonal kind an animal has. All right, I'm done.
Awesome. All right. So with that, thank you everybody for being here. Yes, it's been a bit of a longer introduction, and we like that. We like the change of pace, guys. So we really appreciate your patience on the panel today. And we're going to spoil you guys because we're going to go into a full hour of open discussion with all these brilliant ideas laid out on the table. We're going to explore and, try to see where we agree and disagree. So, yeah, if you haven't already hit the like button, I will also advise if you like what you're hearing from any of our speakers, if we don't have them tagged right now in our description or in our podcast description, we will have them there as soon as we get those made available. So sorry if there's not right there now. And on top of that, we do Q&A. So if you have questions, anything that you're hearing right now, you have a question for any of our speakers, you can do a super chat. That will get you priority. We already got a few super chats, so the sooner you get them in, the sooner we'll be able to ask them. And with that, we're going to go into an hour of open discussion. So yeah, let's hand it back over to Dr. Campbell to respond to what he just heard there from Ben, and then feel free to jump in as it seems polite, fellas. Go ahead there, Travis.
Well, if we're doing the open discussion now, I think Ben I think you wanted to just throw some questions at us because you had some questions for us to get this going. So we'd be happy to start with you throwing questions at us.
Okay, yes. So one question I wanted to ask is, how exactly would you define contingent? Because the definition I am working with, which I know differs a little bit from the typical definition in contemporary philosophy, is it's the definition that I think Aquinas would hold, which is that something is contingent just in case it can fail to exist, and it's not impossible that it exists, and it depends on other things for its existence. Um, do you think that change and the fact that something changes and is finite is also essential to its contingency, or and
Yes.
is that part of the very definition of the term contingent
There's
for
one
you?
thing, if I could throw in, Travis, before you respond to the substance of his question, and that is just a glossary clarification. And that is that that the juxtaposition of contingent and necessary that is typical in contemporary analytic doesn't track exactly the medieval usage of those terms, because something could fail to exist and still be a necessary being in Aquinas's understanding. So that doesn't pick out what contingent means in medieval. And I'm not saying that that's the way we ought to use it. I'm just saying it's an occasion for some confusion if someone's expecting the contemporary distinction of contingent and necessary to map exactly on top. So, and that's what his third way of the 5 ways traffics in, is a thing that is necessary through another and necessary in itself. So really the distinction in Aquinas is a contingent being is a being that has the capacity to decompose, but only a creature or only a being that could decompose would be one who is composed of form and matter, basically what we might call a physical object. So in Aquinas's notion, an angel who isn't composed of form and matter, but just form, is a necessary being. But the reason why it's a necessary being through another is because it is composed in another sense of act and of existence and essence. All right. So it's possible that its essence could lose its existence, but that's only possible because of the action of God. Whereas a contingent being who is form and matter, it's possible for the form and matter to separate, which means the being doesn't exist. A tree burns up or whatever. So that's just one of the distinctions. There's actually several other glossary terms that are used differently in medieval philosophy that I have found to be an occasion, not on the part of you guys, but I'm saying just in general, of people that try to map contemporary glossary back on the medieval, and they don't quite get what Aquinas was saying. Not that they would agree with it if they did get it. I'm just saying it's a little bit different than that. So
All
that's
right,
just
so
glossary
Mr.
clarification.
Bavar was nodding his head along at one point there, so I'll give him a chance to quickly respond there, because that was you said a quick point, but go ahead and respond, and then I'll hand it over to you, Travis. There.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, what I'm hearing is at least the dependence is an essential part of contingency, even if that's not part of the definition of contingency in contemporary philosophy, because contemporary philosophers normally just say something's contingent as long as it's not impossible for it to exist and it can fail to exist. They don't add anything about dependence, but
Right.
the
If I
dependence
understand
is definitely necessary. Yeah.
yeah, if I understand things correctly, we're a contingent being in modern analytical philosophy is often construed as a kind of logical contingency. So something that doesn't exist in all possible worlds, for example.
Mm.
And so what Richard and I are working off of is something which may be described as actually contingent. And if I look out into the world, I see that things are changing and finite, and I also notice their dependency. And just a run-of-the-mill dictionary is going to give you a definition of these terms where they're sort of overlapping. A dependent being just is a contingent being, and a contingent being just is changing and finite. However, when you start getting to the metaphysics, you start getting into a very particular understanding of contingency, as Richard said, is that which is composed of matter and form. And then when you look at a necessary being in Aquinas's sense of, say, a pure form that is nevertheless dependent, that still has a kind of finitude to it, because angels experience, for example, substantial change, even if they don't experience accidental changes. So, yeah, we are using a very specific metaphysical definition of contingency, but the window into that would be just our notification of physical things around us just changing, they're finite and so forth.
Right, yes. So angels, even though they're not composed of matter and form, they're contingent in that they are composed because they have essence and existence as parts, correct?
Right.
Right.
He
Okay.
Aquinas reserves the term contingent for natural substances because they decompose. They are subject to corruption. He would
Okay.
use the word necessary for angels as a kind of derivative necessity. As pure forms composed of essence and existence, they depend upon God for their existence, and they have finitude, and they experience substantial change. So,
Okay. Okay. So I think it would be appropriate probably at this point to get a little bit more into that Thomistic mereology, that theory of the types of parts that contingent things have. Um, so first of all, could you maybe explain a little bit what matter and form are? I think the audience probably doesn't totally get that. I know you kind of explained that in your opening, that matter is the principle of change and diversity, and form is the principle of persistence over time, something along those lines. Um,
sure.
but there's a little more to what matter and form are. That all that really tells us is that matter explains change and diversity, and form explains persistence over time, but that doesn't really tell us what they are in themselves, matter and form. So what are those? Could you explain that for the audience?
Richard, do you want to take this, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I'll start if you want. So, in Aristotle, form is basically answering the question, what is it? It's the definition of a thing. The matter of a thing is what individuates it from other things in that same class or kind. So the form would be, for example, tree, but then the matter would individuate tree to be this particular tree. What distinguishes the classical tradition, of which Aquinas we would consider to be sort of the zenith, if you will, what distinguishes that from what you find more commonly in later modern philosophy and then explicitly in contemporary analytic philosophy, is that in the classical tradition, when we say that a tree is composed of matter and form, neither the matter nor the form are themselves things. They're metaphysical aspects of a thing, so that the real thing is actually this individual tree. Again, this is Aristotle, not Plato. This individual tree is what's real. But Aristotle, for reasons that we can go into if it's needed, is going to argue that those aspects of it, namely what it is and its individuation, are something metaphysically real in the thing. And that impacts his epistemology, which Aquinas also picks up a little bit later on, as opposed to, say, an Occam anomalist who would just deny that they are anything other than just conceptual or categories or whatever. They don't really pick out anything that's metaphysically constituent of the thing. But that's what form is, basically its definition, its whatness. Matter is its thisness, its individuation.
And so Aristotle, for example, would say if you have a form, that makes you by definition existent. So for Aquinas, because he saw that there was a further distinction underlying even the distinction between matter and form, was able to say things like, well, just because you have form doesn't mean you exist. So there are all kinds of property-bearing things or essences out there that have attributes which may not exist.
All right, before we continue on, let's get Ben Watkins in here. So, Ben, we've gone over a couple ideas here in our open discussion. Let us know where you're at and what you think so far of some of the ideas that have been put on the table.
So where I would like to kind of pick up in the discussion is Dr. Howe had mentioned some reservations about my broadly abductive method. So I know that this is jargon. So let me briefly explain what I mean by this. So there's generally three forms of reasoning that are accepted within analytic philosophy. And so the first, being the most common, is deduction. So the idea of logical entailment. There's also a method that's called induction, the idea of instantial generalization. So the idea that the future will resemble the past. But the method that I'm appealing to today in my arguments is what C.S. Peirce called abduction. And so it's the idea of fitting a hypothesis to our experience. And this often goes by, more colloquially, the term inference to the best explanation. And so the idea here is that human imagination is potentially infinite. And so how do we distinguish mere human imagination from a mind-independent reality? And so I began my methodology from the assumption that the best way of understanding what the world is like is by experiencing the world and our explanatory theorizing about it. So the idea of what helps increase our intelligibility of the world. And so I find this methodology uncontroversial. So both theists and naturalists alike accept inference to the best explanation, or what Peirce called abduction. And that even if we were to appeal to other methods like deduction and induction, those are part of our background knowledge. And so that we can, all parties to this discussion can agree on the world that the mind-independent world that we all experience. But where we're going to disagree is on the explanatory theorizing about it. And so my explanatory theorizing, in my opening statement, I argued, is both more modest and more coherent. So I appeal to things that are virtually uncontroversial. So the idea that I appeal to the law of likelihood, which is entailed by the Kolmogorov axioms of probability, the definition of conditional probability, and the definition of an epistemic reason. So the three of these things entail the law of likelihood. I appealed to experiences that we all can agree are facts about the world. So, for example, I used facts about suffering. I appealed to depression, dread, and non-human animal pain. And I don't think anyone here today, any parties to this discussion, deny that those are part of our experience, nor do I think they deny the observations I appealed to in my hiddenness argument. So the idea that there are non-resistant non-theists, that there are people who genuinely do not believe that God exists, and that this lack of belief is not due to behavioral or emotional opposition towards a relationship with God. And so the idea is how can we best make intelligible sense of these facts? And so my abductive method, I think, makes intelligible sense of those facts in a way that entails a conclusion that classical theism is probably false.
Let's hand it over to Dr. Howe here. I'll let you wrap
Yeah,
up.
so I'd like to know, like, what precisely, if we're not challenging any of the premises that I've put on the table, what is it exactly about abduction that is being challenged here? And what is the alternative being put forward instead of this abductive method?
So I think a more precise way to express our concerns is not so much that we reject abduction and we're offering some other kind of method that's global. We argue that abduction works wonderfully with respect to certain aspects of human knowing, like scientific theories, historical paradigms, and things like that. But when it comes to some of the more technical, philosophical, or metaphysical contentious points that we got accused of in a fun way, I don't think abduction serves us at all. I mean, for example, I would say, well, I think my intellect is able to recognize what a tree is, despite the fact that, and really because of the fact that I was able as a child to experience a variety of different kinds of trees with different shapes, different sizes, different levels of growth, but the intellect is able to identify this common kind called tree. Now the debate is my intellect picking out something metaphysically real in those trees, which Aristotle Aquinas would call the form, or not? Well, I don't think the answer to that question always would take the shape of it's the best explanation. Well, I think it is the explanation, not that it's just the best, that it's the only explanation. Okay, but why I might think that probably wouldn't sound a lot like what people would identify as abduction, that it's got explanatory scope or whatever. I mean, there might be some way where you could pick out those characteristics in a way. But our point is that when we're arguing essence existence distinction or act and potency or substance and accident or teleology or four different causes, those kind of issues are of a philosophical nature that they're not susceptible to the sort of lurking scientism that I think contemporary abduction has done. So, you know, we just find, in fact, I think that's the reason why a lot of contemporary philosophers aren't classical, because the methods by which they've become used to adjudicating things in the rest of their life, they also use in their speculative philosophical life. And I think it probably doesn't deliver. It doesn't deliver, I don't think, or at least it seems to not deliver.
In addition to that,
in other words, it doesn't deliver that conclusion that the classical person would contend for.
All right, go ahead.
And just to add to that, when we're assessing whether the butler killed the master, an abductive method is spot on, because you're looking for the best explanation for who committed this murder. So in forensic science, abduction is a great method. If you're looking for the most plausible explanation for an historical event, reasoning to the best explanation is a very good method, as Richard was saying. But what do you take as your background knowledge when assessing a metaphysical claim? Well, we would suggest that you're taking your metaphysics. So all probabilistic reasoning, because it is measured by a background knowledge, to assess that background knowledge is circular reasoning. And therefore, in order to get at the truth of what the true metaphysical system is, we think a deductive approach grounded in experience is the way to go about establishing that metaphysics.
And
Okay.
if I may, I'm sorry,
Go ahead. Yes.
just one clarification, because I don't want to add except to say that just as I suggested, the word contingent is used differently in classical thinking than contemporary, whichever one's better. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just saying they're different. Also, deduction and induction, especially induction, means something very different in Aristotle in the classical tradition than it does in contemporary logic. It just means something different. So just be aware that if we're reading medieval back to the classics and the subject of induction comes up, they're almost always going to be thinking of something different than what we as contemporaries would think by that term.
Okay. Just before you guys carry on, I'll pause the timer. We just closed the first poll that we did. Does God exist? 52% in our live chat voted yes, God does exist. 38% voted no, God does not exist. And 5% voted beginning to feel like a rap god. And then 3% said I believe in many gods. So we'll carry on with our timer. Let's hand it over. Ben were trying to get in there. So whoever would like to launch us into some rebuttal there, you guys feel free.
Okay, I think I'll comment on something that Richard said in response to my critique of their first two stages. So he was saying that every actualization is an actualization of existence. So it's illicit to distinguish between the actualization of existence and the actualization of action, or distinguish between inducing a change in something and making it exist. So I take it that the claim is that even a per se series like the case of the man's pushing the stone with a stick has to terminate in an uncaused cause. Is that correct? Because that does involve it's per se, so it's got, you know, causality distributed throughout the whole series, and it involves the actualization of accidents of position or changing position of things, which they don't have to have. They don't have to have the positions they end up having as a result. So those are accidental features.
I might not have been clear, and maybe because I stumbled on my words or I was going too fast, but no, not every actualization is the actualization of existence. What I said was that final level, or that top level of the metaphysics, it's existence that comes into play at that level, because it's also applicable to use the word actualization with respect to the relationship between form and matter. In fact, that's what Aristotle does, as Travis said. For Aristotle, to exist just is to have form, and that's as far as it goes. Aquinas is going to say form and matter together make essence, and essence is in potency to existence. So I meant to just emphasize that very last level. And so the reason it mattered then was because I was trying to make the argument that both the accident of a substance and the substance have existence, obviously in different ways, because a substance can sustain on its own, so to speak. It's not in something, but the color of the dog is in the dog, right? But the color is still real. It has existence. If it didn't, it wouldn't be really the color that it was. So that was all I was trying to defend. So that in the context of how I took your language, that you wanted to distinguish actualizers of existence and actualizers of actions. Both of those are actualizers of existence. It's just that one is the actualizer of the existence of the substance. The other is an actualizer of the existence of the accident. That was the point I was trying to make in that context.
Okay, not that a series of actualizers of the existence of accidents has to terminate in an uncaused cause.
Well, I think the fact that anything exists is because there is something that is subsistent existence itself. Otherwise, nothing would be existing. By analogy, if the motor's not there, the gears don't turn, because it's not of the nature of a gear to turn. It's not of the nature of a tree to exist. So therefore, it must be having existence by something that is subsistent existence.
Right, because there are no accidents unless there are substances. Okay.
Right, unless you're Plato, which I'm not.
Okay.
I mean, he just makes everything we would identify as a substance or an accident just all to be form. And I mean, that's not my view, but that in deference to him, that's what he would say. I think he's wrong.
Okay. Okay. I have to admit, at the moment, I'm not sure. I think you might have tried to argue that a per accident series cannot explain a per se series, but I'm not fully grasping.
I was trying to say that. And you know, every illustration we give obviously will break down if we press it, but it's trying to get someone to see that no matter how many gears you have turning, unless there's a motor, they wouldn't turn, because it's not of the nature of a gear as gear to turn. So by analogy, it's not of the nature of a tree to exist. Existence is something different than tree. It's different than its essence. So whatever that existence, however we go on to describe what that is, it's having the tree having the existence. It's being given that existence. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist at any moment. It has to be continually given that existence. And that could only be possible in our model because there is something that if anything exists at all, something has to be existence by its very nature and isn't given existence. That's the only thing that can give existence to something else, ultimately, is something that's subsistent existence itself. That's the model we're trying to defend in classical. And then you go from there to unpack its attributes. I think someone said earlier, was talking about, forget now about the, let me see if I got it in my notes. I forget now. It was something about trying to pit one of the attributes of God as if that argument for that attribute was the same as our argument for the existence of God. And those are kind of two different arguments. Once his existence is sought to be demonstrated as being subsistent existence itself, then the attributes, you have to give individual arguments for why is he all powerful? Why, this is what Aquinas does in questions 3 through 25 in his Summa.
And if I could just press a point,
Sure thing.
When you say that the swimming pool, once filled, doesn't need an external cause to remain filled, we would grant that, of course, because there you're talking about the acquisition of an accident. So even though the acquisition of the accident required an external cause, the actual maintaining that water in the pool doesn't, because a pool is conducive to holding water. In contrast, when we're talking about existence and not merely the acquisition of essences to an the acquisition of accidents to an essence, we're talking about that. A contingent being is not conducive to existence. It is just wholly indifferent to existence, even after it exists. That's why in the opening statement, I said existentially neutral Darth Vader does not exist, and existentially neutral tree in front of me does exist. They're both true statements. And so if a contingent being is passively potent with respect to existence from moment to moment, it must be a received existence rather than existence itself, or just sufficient into and unto itself to exist.
All right. Any commentary over there, Ben Watkins? It's been a couple minutes, and yeah, I was going to say, you and Richard, you pick your moments, it seems, and then you just come in here with a collective of thoughts. So go ahead if you would like there, Ben Watkins.
Yeah, so I guess I'm gonna bounce back to the conversation that I was having a second ago about the abductive methodology that I was using in comparing the two hypotheses on the table, one being classical theism and the other being naturalism or metaphysical naturalism. And so what matters about the arguments is not the form, but the epistemic probability of the premises that we appeal to. And the premises of Thomistic arguments can be targeted using these abductive means. So what do I mean by this? So for example, Dr. Howe and Dr. Campbell have posited the existence of sustaining causes, concurrent sustaining causes. But naturalists like Ben Bavar and I, we can put forward a different model of reality that doesn't contain such a series of causes. In fact, Ben has provided us with some reasons to be skeptical of that model. And so deciding between these models is going to require us to decide based on the theoretical virtues of the two models. And so that just brings us right back to where I began in my abductive methodology, to our experience of the world and our explanatory theorizing about it. So there's not going to be any sort of deductive demonstration that's going to show why sustaining causation is preferable in their model to our model, which might posit something like existential inertia. So the idea that things just continue in existence from the moment they begin to exist without any concurrent sustaining causation. You're not going to be able to put forward a purely deductive argument to decide between that. To decide between the models, we're going to have to appeal to the theoretical virtue. And so I would also want to press Dr. Campbell and Dr. Howe in that their second response to my arguments concedes this abductive method, because if I'm not mistaken, he said that there were some evidences that were to raise the probability of classical theism and count against naturalism. Well, in order to make that sort of claim, it's going to be essentially comparative. And so in order to even get those claims off the ground, we're going to be within the abductive methodology that I've put on the table. And that we're not going to be able to decide between these models by merely appealing to deductive methods.
Okay, here's part of the problem. Graham Oppie did write a response to Paul Draper's paper on the evidential problem of evil, and this is what he says. Thus, even if there is nothing to dispute in the details of Draper's argument, I find it hard to believe that it is a successful argument against belief in a perfect being. His argument does not show that by their own rights, reasonable, reflective, and well-informed theists have good reason to give up their theistic beliefs. In the paper, Oppie does entertain the thought, well, what if you have a theist that already has other reasons for thinking that God exists? Is this the kind of consideration that would dissuade him? He also points out that there are problems with even the notion of an epistemic probability. Now, I'm not sure if Oppie has evolved since then. He wrote this paper in the 90s, but it's an ambiguous notion. And what we're saying is that how you judge a probability of any statement is going to be ultimately determined by your worldview, which that you're already using to assess the probability of whether it's true. And so I think one of the reasons why a lot of theists and atheists have run into loggerheads is because they're using an abductive method, and they're both assessing the probabilities of their premises or evidences with that background knowledge in place. And that's why Richard and I, even though, if we want to concede abduction for the sake of discussion, we think that we can come up with some prizes too on naturalism. And so now the debate either becomes a stalemate, or you just start trying to beat each other out on who has the more quantitative lines of evidence that are surprising on the other worldview. We can think of I thought of 8 off the top of my head as I was reading your paper, or your opening. So quantitatively, then naturalism is just more surprising, given these facts, than theism, and so theism wins by quantitative probability. I'm just not sure that's the best way to go about assessing a worldview. But when you play that game, I still think that there are problems with atheism.
All right. I know that he's given you quite the steak to chew on there, but Dr. Howe, you were nodding your head along. So if you want to give like a 30-second add-on, go ahead.
No, I mean, I think a lot of the things that we hear Ben Watkins say about abduction, we would agree with. However, I would observe, or did observe, that in some sense, any data can be arranged as a deductive argument. The deduction is just in an important sense, deduction is just a comment on the form of an argument in terms of premises and conclusion. It has nothing to do with the content of the argument. So even the most rigorous abductive argument could be cast as a categorical syllogism, or a hypothetical syllogism, or whatever, and it would be by definition deductive, but it doesn't detract from its abductive value just because it was recast as a deductive argument. And historically, in the classical tradition, the deductive method has to do with the relationship of reducing a system of knowledge to its first principles, which different dimensions of knowledge, like botany or zoology, whatever, would have governing first principles of that particular science. And so the methods would be this sort of reduction, if you will, you could call it in some context. So I'm not trying to quibble over terminology. It probably sounds like I'm picking at nits with respect to the terms, but I just think that the difference between, a lot of times the difference is really getting to the content of the premises of the arguments we make, regardless. And then with respect to induction, well, maybe that'll come up a little bit later. I'll save that for another segment.
All right, let's hand it over to Ben Bavar. Go ahead there.
Okay. So we were saying that there can't really be series of actualizers of accidents without series of actualizers of substances, because there can be no accidents in the first place without substances. So let's talk about maybe what I was talking about in my critique, the fact that it seems like there are these things, elementary particles, that are at the foundation of maybe all of the per se series of actualizers of substances. So first of all, do you think that there are series of makers other than just like mereological ones where parts compose wholes, or are those the only ones that?
So Aristotle would distinguish between natural kinds and then artifacts, right? And we may quarrel with where he draws that line, but by and large, a natural kind would be like a tree or a dog or a person of the world that you just find, whereas an artifact would be like a rocking chair. So it's very often in teaching philosophy that philosophy teachers would use artifacts to illustrate metaphysical points, like Aristotle's four causes. The wood is the material cause of the car, of the rocking chair, and the carpenter's the efficient cause, and the idea of rocking chair in his mind is the formal cause, and then to rock on the front porch is the final cause. We illustrate these things by artifacts, but they don't really obtain with artifacts in exactly the same way as it does a natural kind. So I'm willing to I admit that there are lots of things, the existence of which or the nature of which is just this mereological sum. That's certainly true of artifacts like a laptop or whatever. But when we start getting to natural kinds, and I'm not sure I know, not only do I not know where Aristotle or Aquinas would clearly draw the line, I know I don't know where I would draw the line. But if you're talking about things like fundamental particles and things like this, I just go, well, whatever we're going to say about those things, we ultimately are going to probably make some judgment about whether we think they're real or not, right? Because there may be some things we'll discuss that we don't particularly think are real, but they're instrumental categories, like say way the Hawking does in his Brief History of Time, right? That's fine. But I'm saying at some point we might ask the question, are these things real or not? But to ask whether they're real or not is to ask whether they exist. But then to talk about existence, we're right back into the metaphysics again. We're no longer doing physics, we're doing metaphysics. So again, I could probably choke on exactly where some of the lines are drawn in composite things and natural kinds, for example. But I think the principles are there, even if they're blurry at some of the edges.
Yeah, so it's hard to decide where to go from here. We had some big thinking faces in the center there. You guys were were really contemplating what you were hearing there. Travis, if you'd like to maybe make an add-on here, and then Ben, we'll get you in here as well. Ben Watkins.
Well, I was wondering if I could ask a question to Ben Bavar, and that
sure.
concerns your notion of causality. As I was reading it, you were saying, like with the hand moving the stick moving the stone, even when the stick presses up against the stone, it's not that pressing that causes it, but rather the event before it. Am I hearing that right or getting that right?
So here's what I was thinking. Like, there's going to be a whole, like, if this lasts longer than a single moment, and it's going to have to, in order for any motion to happen, for position to change, the position of the rock, the position of the hand and whatnot. So let's take the stick and the stone in particular. It's not just, so there are going to be simultaneous events of the sticks moving and the stones moving while this causal series holds, but it's not the simultaneous events that are causally related to each other. I think it's rather the prior event, so the stick. So if we imagine the very beginning of this whole series, when the stick starts pressing against the stone is not moving yet, right when the stick touches the stone at first. But that first touching of the stone, that is what causes the stone to move in the subsequent moment. And then it might continue for a while, and there are going to be simultaneous motions, but it's not the simultaneous ones that are causally related.
So for you, causality is not a simultaneous relation.
No, I do not believe it is. Yes, I believe causes are always temporarily prior to their effects. That is, they happen at times earlier than their effects.
Okay, I'd like to hear either of you, just to hear what you say about this critique. I was listening to Ben Watkins' conversation with, I think it was Trey Jadlow. Am I getting his name right? I think you had a conversation with him a few years back.
Yes, I thought that's how you say his name.
And so you and I mean, he's a fellow Christian and all that, but I thought you won the discussion because, and this is if I understand you, you were saying that you could have a past eternal universe, and in Richard and my way of speaking, it would be a a series of accidental causes or accidental events, which just never has a beginning. And we think that's a logical possibility. That's why, we're not arguing the Kalam argument tonight, for example. We're arguing that even if the universe is eternal, there has to be an eternal sustainer. But in your discussion with him, he kept accusing you of saying that these events are uncaused. And you were saying, no, they're not uncaused. The contingent effect has an explanation. Now, what I would press is that it is precisely because all causality is per se, so that at the moment of impact, it's a simultaneous impact. Now, once the effect obtains in an accidental series, the effect can move on without that cause that brought it into being existing or continuing to cause it. And that is why, on at least the way you were talking to Mr. Jadlow, it was a few years ago, so maybe you've changed, but the way I was hearing you say, well, no, the events are simultaneous, but it's just that you don't need you were saying you don't need a sustaining cause, but you're also saying that that cause doesn't need to keep explaining it after it comes into being. And this is why your infinite regress isn't like this mindless, totally lacking explanation sort of worldview, because each event has an explanation. It's just that it's an explanation that causes it simultaneously and it moves on into the future. And that's why you can, at least in principle, as a logical possibility, have a past eternal universe. But what I'm hearing Mr. Bavar saying is that, no, it's the event that precedes it. And so my problem with that is, well, then we don't ever really get to an explanation because there's no simultaneous impact of cause and effect there.
All right. It sounds like it's a good opportunity for both speakers to respond, because it looks like Watkins has been waiting here to make a statement. So if you want to jump in here, and then Bavar, if you want to hold on to maybe a response to what you just heard there, go ahead there, Watkins.
But I was muted. Okay. So you're right that I had this discussion with Trey Jadlow a couple of years ago. So forgive me if if I forget what I said exactly in that conversation. But I believe what I was putting on the table was a model of a way in which we can make coherent sense of the idea of the universe being self-caused. And so what I was trying to articulate at the time, if memory serves me right, is that the universe was an infinite sequence of states of the universe, with each state being an individual caused by an earlier state of the universe, and that the reason that the whole of the universe exists was because it was composed of or identical with all of those successively caused states. So to kind of, I guess, broadly sketch that argument here for the audience so that they can kind of understand what that looks like, is that each state of the universe is going to be sufficiently caused by earlier parts of the universe, and that the existence of the universe as a whole is entailed by the existence of all the parts that compose that whole. And so the obtaining of that entailment relation between the causally explained parts and the universe they compose is the sufficient reason why the universe exists rather than nothing at all. And so that this was a potential explanation to the question of why is there something rather than nothing. So
well,
I
just want to clarify. So you were not saying, as I thought you were not saying that causality is simultaneous as I was describing it. There's a simultaneous impact between cause and effect, and then the effect moves on, and the cause no longer has an impact on it, like the father producing the sun who produces his sun and so forth in a temporal accidental series. You were not saying that.
I'll be honest with you, I don't remember. I'd have to go back
Okay.
and listen to the
Okay.
conversation because
Well, I don't remember half of what I say to
my.
I don't
Oh, go
remember
ahead.
half of what I say to my students yesterday. So I was like, oh, I said that. So I that's
Yeah.
fine. But I just thought that it was just interesting. I didn't know if there was a dispute between you two. I'm not trying to drive a wedge. I've always taken those who believe in existential inertia to be saying that at the point of impact, the cause is simultaneous with the effect. It's just that the effect will move on later. The motion of the stick, yes, is part of the causal explanation of the moving of the stone, but it is an impactful simultaneous movement once the stick hits the stone. And my fear, and I'll give it to you, Mr. Bavar, to answer this. My fear is that you're going to end up just having no explanation for any event, because when you have an infinite regress like that, that just is the lack of an explanation for anything. And it's part of the tool of the philosopher's toolkit to just be repulsed by infinite regresses because they don't explain anything. So,
Okay. So I was hearing you say that it seems like there needs to be some kind of simultaneous causation in the case of the stick pressing against the stone, because one thing that's really essential to the sticks causing the stone to move is that there is physical contact between them, and that happens in a single moment, right? The stick is pressing against the stone at a single moment. Right, it's touching the stone, and so that has to do with the relative positions of the stick and the stone. Um, and they can be situated in those ways all in a single moment. And I would say, yes, it is in virtue of that physical contact that exists in a single moment that there is causation, a transfer of causal influence. Um, but I would not say that the causation itself is all happening in a single moment, because the only way that motions are changes in position, right? And the only way a change in position can happen is if there are two different times where the object is at different positions. Um, so there is no such thing as a motion being caused without there being multiple moments over which that causation unfolds.
but if there's not a simultaneous impact at some point, I just don't see how you generate the effect. Again, if you keep
There,
just pushing it back, we never have an efficient cause
Okay, just one
of the
second.
specific event.
It seems like he was trying to clarify a little bit. So if you want to take like 10 seconds to clarify, and then we'll hand it back over.
Oh yeah,
okay,
please clarify all you want.
right.
I just was curious.
Simultaneous impact. I'm not entirely sure how to model the idea of an impact in terms of my model of causation, but yes, there definitely is this simultaneous like touching. The stick is touching the stone because of their relative positions. They're right up against each other at a single moment. That's true. And it is because of that partly that the stick is able to cause the stone to move. I would agree.
All right, let's enter the other side. And don't mind me if you see me making faces. I was just looking at the live chat. So go ahead there, Travis, if you're ready.
Well, I mean, I guess this is just an impasse between us, but I'm just not convinced that that's a plausible model of causation. All causes, at least on our model, are per se, but not all causal series are per se. So even in an accidental series, the cause and effect relationship is also always a per se, because this effect or this cause through itself causes another.
And I throw an illustration in as I heard somebody say, throw a monkey into the wrench, instead of throw a monkey wrench into the works. What would you guys say about, let's say you had a a snow boot in the snow so that the boot causes the boot print, but both the boot and the snow were eternal. So there never was a beginning to the boot or the boot print. Would you acknowledge that there is an ontological priority to the boot and the print, even if there's not a temporal priority in their causal relationship?
All right. I think let's hand it over to Ben Watkins to respond to that. And if you're hanging out in the live audience and you're wondering what this is all about, we are debating. I don't have my boot cup. I can't be a proper Canadian without I have a glass that is literally a boot for these purposes. But if you're wondering what this is all about, you can hit the like button, share this out. We are debating, does God exist? And if you haven't already, if you have questions, we do have super chats coming up. We got 10 minutes left to our open discussion. Let me just pause it. Nobody wants to waste time with me talking and padding out. Ben Watkins, the floor is over to you. I'll resume the time.
Yeah, so I wanted to, again, return back to the objections that were raised against the objective method that I was putting forward, because it seemed to me that one of the objections involved that we're evaluating the evidence from our individual background knowledge, and so that we kind of end up in this stalemate position. And so I wanted to point out that the arguments that I gave tonight appealed to background knowledge that all of the disagreeing parties can concede. So both theists and atheists concede that suffering and divine hiddenness are surprising given theism, and a matter of course given naturalism. So that's why there's in the literature what's known as the problem of evil and the problem of divine hiddenness, is because all parties concede that this is at least a prima facie problem. And both atheists and theists concede that classical theism is not much more probable intrinsically than naturalism. That's to say that naturalism is at least a plausible alternative hypothesis to classical theism. And so my argument was that if we start with the shared experience of suffering and non-resistant non-theists, and all parties to the discussion can concede that naturalism is a plausible alternative hypothesis, and that divine hiddenness and suffering are surprising, giving one hypothesis than another, then that entails deductively that classical theism is probably false, other things being equal. Now, you're very right to say that we could appeal to other considerations that might raise the probability of classical theism back up. And you alluded to 8 that you had thought of, but are these 8 evidences that both theists and atheists are going to be able to concede? Those who disagree about religion are going to be able to concede. I would suspect that they're not. I'm suspect either that the observation is one that is itself contentious, or the claim involved that it's surprising given naturalism and a matter of course given classical theism is contentious. So it's not clear to me that we've ended up at a stalemate here. I think that involving the background knowledge of all disagreeing parties, we're still going to have involved claims in my argument that deductively entail at least a good reason, that is a prima facie reason, to reject classical theism. And so if we're not going to dispute the form of that argument, and we're not going to dispute the premises themselves, it seems to me that that's a successful argument.
All right. It seems like Travis is going to jump in here. Oh, Richard as
Before
well.
Before he does, if I just make one quick observation before Travis, because this is really something that he wrote in his opening about what's surprising, 8 things surprising. And this is not your fault, and it's not anybody's fault. But I suspect that what appears to you to be the quote consensus is because there are probably little to no existential Thomists in your pool, so to speak. that is contemporary analytic, even if they're Thomists, they're going to be contemporary analytic Thomists. Now, I'm not saying they're wrong because of that. I'm just saying it's different. And you're debating us, and that's not your fault either, but we're this eccentric tradition of Thomism. It's not eccentric with respect to Thomism, but it's eccentric with respect to contemporary philosophy that traffics in these things in the categories of classical thought and makes essay or existence the primacy of the metaphysics. That sort of sets some boundaries as to what we would consider to be, or whether we would consider ourselves to be included in that. Well, all of them concede this about divine hiddenness, because I wouldn't concede those things. But let me hand it over to Travis to pick up there.
Well, Richard is just making the point that we're weird. We're very strange people. I do dispute the idea that evil is surprising on theism. Now, I think that sounds counterintuitive to a modern audience because, evil has an emotional impact on us. I mean, in my own book, the opening chapter, I share my own experiences with evil and how I almost lost my faith. I almost joined you guys on this in this journey of philosophy. But I think what would be surprising on theism is not the existence of evil, but the existence of unjustifiable evils. And it's notoriously difficult to prove that God has no rational justification or moral justification for allowing the evils that he allows. And this is why Graham Oppy himself said that this is not the kind of argument that's going to move a theist. And it's not even necessarily the kind of argument that's going to move somebody that's sort of trying to adjudicate the two options. Because given the basic possibility that God has a good reason for allowing evil to exist, then it's at least that the argument is unsound deductively. And again, then we go back to, well, what's surprising? Well, that depends on your worldview. Again, with the hiddenness argument, I'm not surprised as a theist that there are seekers of truth that don't yet believe. You said non-resistant non-theists. We call those seekers, wayfarers. And even the New Testament has examples of this, like Cornelius, or even the Pharisee that comes to Jesus, and Jesus says, you are not far from the kingdom of heaven. So classical theology has that kind of category for the seeker who's not yet grabbed on to faith in God, has not believed, but they're not rebellious in the sense that, say, some rank pagan or hedonist might be rebellious against God. And this to throw a few things out, I'm not going to just run through my 8 because I don't want to gobble up too much time, but some of the things that I thought of that I think are surprising on naturalism are some things that naturalists themselves have raised questions about. So I'm not saying that these are absolutely secure arguments, but here's something at all exists. Heidegger said that whether something exists, that's the quintessential metaphysical question. And you have people like Mortimer Adler and Ed Feser who have become theists from atheism to theism, reflecting on that. Or how about the reliability of our cognitive faculties? Richard Carrier and P.Z. Myers have gone on record to say that given naturalism, as you define it, that mindless causes bring these things about, that given naturalism, we have to conclude that our cognitive abilities are not reliable guides in attaining truth. But if that's true, then we can't really trust our cognitive faculties to develop an abductive method to adjudicate metaphysical truth claims. Or how about the origin of the universe? Robert Jastrow, who is an agnostic, says this is surprising. This is something that we didn't expect. And you do have people like my friend Hugh Ross, who, as an atheist, became a theist in light of that evidence.
All right.
And again, I could go on, but I'm just trying to communicate the point. I know that you're going to put up resistances to some of these arguments, but it seems surprising to me that someone would trust in their cognitive faculties that they believe they're a result of chance. But I also know that there's a kind of impasse between us, and that's why I think our deductive approach grounded in a metaphysic is the right approach to discerning these things.
All right, we still have, I was going to inject and say 2 minutes on the floor, but it's really up to you guys. We don't have a huge amount of super chats yet. So if you're hanging out in the live chat and you haven't asked a question yet to any of our speakers, we've got Dr. Howe here, Dr. Campbell, Ben Watkins, and Ben Bavar. Everybody is here and they are willing to take your questions. We will do 30 minutes of Q&A. Let me just get 2 minutes, let's say 5 minutes back on the floor here. So that we can finish up some of these thoughts here, because we really put a lot on the table. And if you guys want to, we can continue before we get some more questions. But if you're hanging out in the live chat and you have a question, we do appreciate those super chats, and they do help spur new discussion potentially if we haven't, delved into some territory that might be interesting to you, and maybe not our speakers on either side right now. So let me set another 5-minute timer and we'll carry on with our discussion.
I would like to hear, if it's okay. I'm not trying to direct which way the discussion goes, but I was taken aback by your observation or your comment that our cognitive faculties are the result of mindless chance. How would you defend the fact that they pick out anything true then if they're just caused by antecedent physical state?
Yeah, so I think that biological evolution is a mindless chance process that non-randomly selects for biological features of humans. And so I think that cognitive faculties that can reliably perceive truth in the world have survival advantages. So I think there's just one truth. And so that beings that have cognitive faculties that can reliably discover truths in the world can then communicate those truths and have better social organization. And so that these mindless chance processes like natural selection selected us for mostly reliable cognitive faculties, but that we also have cognitive imperfections, and that we find that we have certain negative heuristics and biases because evolution selected us for that. And so they're just good enough to give us the advantages that they did on the African savannah.
But how would you deal with these objections that they're kind of maybe connected? One, it would seem like that evolution would only need to give us its consistency, but not necessarily truth. And then as an extension of that, what would be your argument that it was actually true that evolution did that without it being a circular argument?
So again, I would take an abductive approach here. And so I would first off look at the experience of the world. I would look at the types of beings that evolution had selected for. And so I think that not only humans have reliable cognitive faculties, I think other non-human animals have reliable cognitive faculties, maybe not to the degrees that we do, but that they do have reliable cognitive faculties. So one of my favorite examples is that bloodhounds, when you bring them to split in a trail, they could go 3 ways. They'll smell one way, they'll smell another. And if they've not gotten the scent, they'll just go down the third path. And so they've inferred an entailment that if the smell is not on this path and it's not on this second path, it must be on this third path. And so I think that having reliable cognitive faculties like that, we were selected for having direct acquaintance with certain truths like that, and that not only humans but non-humans were selected for that, and that the simplest and most coherent explanation with the best explanatory power is one that involves mindless chance processes like random mutations and natural selection.
All right. Any thoughts on the other side before we move into the Q&A? No? All right.
I mean, well, I do.
Go ahead,
I
Travis.
just want to say that I just don't think that there is a necessary connection between truth and survival, as Richard was pointing out. It just seems that you can have a coherent story that allows you to navigate this world, but there's no truth bearing properties that are entering into your mind that allows you to navigate the world to survive. All you need is coherence, and coherence is not necessarily the same as truth. And the other thing that I would just say is the kind of picture you're painting sounds like there's something about these mindless forces that have a kind of directedness to it to bring about these creatures that have reliable cognitive faculties. And so, I mean, or do you believe in at least a kind of intrinsic teleology to the world that maybe doesn't have anything to do with an external cause, but there's something about the evolutionary process that is indirected? Is that, do you understand that question? I mean, is there something about the
I
evolutionary
certainly
process
understand the
that,
question. And so I will say that I don't rule that out a priori.
okay.
So I am sympathetic with Thomas Nagel's infamous book, Mind and Cosmos. So the idea that maybe there is some sort of natural teleology that gives us this kind of third, middle ground route between mindless chance on the one hand and intelligent design on the other. So I don't rule that out a priori. However, I don't think that contemporary evolutionary theory makes use of the idea of teleology, but perhaps some future biology will make use of it. I don't think we can rule it out a priori.
All right, that was the last word. Well, thank you so much to all of our speakers, Ben Bavar, Ben Watkins, Dr. Travis Campbell, and Dr. Richard Howe. We appreciate all of our speakers on the panel. We are going to move into our Q&A, and so if you have questions for any of our speakers, now is the time to get it in. I will also let our speakers know if you would like to, take a moment here to step away, grab yourself a refreshment, whatever you need to do. Now is the time. Speak now or forever hold your pee. All right. Sounds like that's what they're going to do. All right. So we had a couple of votes going on here. Not as many in the last chat. It seems like people are really being kind despite the number of
What it is,
viewership.
we all did such a good job. All the questions have already been answered. So
Not only that, but you've all been so
Good, our
polite.
discussion was excellent.
Yeah, this has been great, guys. Honestly, I really appreciate it. I came in and I was a little bit tired. Like I said, when I came in, I just celebrated an anniversary and I had done a back-to-back gig. And this has been fantastic. You guys have really rocked it. So our live chat in the poll, we appreciate your questions and super chats. Who would you like to grill after the open conversation? This was really tied for a while, and then all of a sudden it just shifted. All right, so we got 19% for Dr. Richard Howe, which you had the most at one point, and then all of a sudden it went over to Ben Watkins and then shot up to Dr. Travis Campbell, and then all of a sudden, yeah, that'll drive you all nuts, all you English yeah, I see one of you laughing, right? It's gonna drive you nuts that I just said that. All of a sudden, everybody wanted to grill Ben Bavar at 35%. Isn't that great? So you guys really tore up our audience here tonight. This was great. Can't stress that enough. If you haven't already, hit the like button. We really appreciate our speakers here tonight. We're going to move into our Q&A. I see a couple more chats coming in, so we're going to shoot right into those, and I'm going to start the timer here. We got 30 minutes. Nobody wanted to step out. So Who's Rich Purnell asks, how can we trust our rationality when we are susceptible to irrationally rationalizing? All right, sorry, I had read that a little bit strange. So when we are susceptible to irrationally rationalizing. So I think that's for our Bens on the panel. So if you guys would like to jump in.
Yeah, so I think that there's always a specter of skepticism that kind of haunts our epistemic inquiries. So there's no guarantee that in our inquiries we are going to find knowledge. However, I do think that we can be directly acquainted with certain truths. So I think that mathematical, logical, and even rational truths are truths that we can be directly acquainted with. And I think that we can also have a knowledge of the world through experience. So to use the jargon in philosophical circles, I think that we can have both a priori knowledge and that we can have a posteriori knowledge, and that all of our judgments to some degree are provisional, in the sense that further reflections on them can help us realize that we were mistaken and that we need to revise some previous judgment. But even then, that judgment itself is going to ultimately come down to what we're acquainted with, what truths we are acquainted with, and what evidence we get from our experience of the world. And so to come back to the point that I was making earlier, I think biological evolution selected us for having systematically truth tracking beliefs, because systematically reliable truth tracking beliefs have survival advantages, whereas I think that systematically false beliefs are not going to have the survival advantages that are often said that they could have if naturalism were true. I don't think that humans would have been able to evolve as far as we have if we were to have systematic, even if it was consistent, but even if we were systematically consistent in having false beliefs, I don't think that that would have survival advantage. I think that would be very detrimental to our cognitive abilities on the African savannah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ben Watkins, for answering the question. And once again, we are doing Super Chat. So if you have a question for any of our speakers, get it in here. We're going to hand it over to the other side to respond to some of what they just heard.
Well, I would like to quote Darwin. I know that both Ben Bavar and Ben Watkins have heard this before, but Darwin said, "With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind have been developed from the mind of lower animals or of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there were any convictions in such a mind?" And I think that the horrid doubt that he experiences is just the fact that I just find myself not able to really trust those faculties if I really take seriously the idea that those faculties arose from mindless causes, mindless, non-goal directed causes. And I think that Ben Watkins, your statement where you said you're open to the idea of Thomas Nagel's suggestion that maybe there's a kind of natural teleology in the world, just is the initial premise of Thomas Aquinas' Fifth Way, where he said that there is an intrinsic finality to the world. This is what Aristotle taught. And he thinks that that implies an extrinsic finality that is imposed on it by God, because if it is truly non-conscious or it can't be truly goal-directed unless there's a mind guiding it. And this is why I sometimes chuckle at documentaries where I see people doing the origin of the universe and stuff, and I will see Neil deGrasse Tyson saying, well, the universe made a way for this to happen, but I don't find that to be meaningful if the universe is not conscious. So I think that your best way out is to employ intrinsic finality to get around the problem.
All right, let's pass the ball.
Then I think that opens up the door for another issue.
All right. Just before we pass it, Richard, we forgot about the cup. We forgot about the cup. What's going on with the cup? You were supposed to do your big promo. All right, there you go. All right, so let's hand it over to the other side and get some thoughts here if they have any, and if not, we'll carry on to the next super chat. Did you have any thoughts there, Ben Bavar?
Oh yeah. So about the question as to why we can trust our rationality when we're always irrationally rationalizing. Seems to me like you actually have to use your rationality to even conclude in the first place that you do irrationally rationalize. So I'm not sure. It seems like a self-defeating challenge to raise in the first place.
Oh, Richard is nodding along. Richard, did you have any
Well,
thoughts?
Unless I just misunderstood what he said, he just made the point that the questioner's trying to get at, that you would have to use your rationality to even speculate that you're irrationally coming you're irrationally coming to conclude that you're rational. That's the point I think the question was trying to get at. There seems to be some unavoidable foundation of the reality of rationality, which seems inexplicable if the antecedent causes of what we identify as rationality just is mindless, really deterministic, which I hasn't gotten introduced into it, but I don't see how it could also arise with any kind of robust notion of free will that would be seemingly a necessary condition for morality. So you could throw that into the mix as well, that this mindless causes of antecedent conditions cause your cognitive faculties to be what they are, then it basically makes it seemingly impossible to be rational and to have free will. But I think they've answered that. I think that's the answer that they have, is that it is survival mechanism, that evolution picks that out. And so the impasse, as I see it, at least for the benefit of tonight, is that whether it's right or wrong to say that survival is truth dependent or just consistency or coherent dependent. And I think that's as far as the debate was able to go tonight.
Okay, let's hand it over to Ben Watkins for the last comment on this question to your side. So Ben Watkins.
Yeah, so I think this kind of harks back to what's often called Agrippa's paradox or the Munchausian trilemma. So this idea that is our knowledge, justification all the way down, or is it an idea that knowledge begins with the coherence of ideas, or do we just take some things as foundation? And so this kind of lays out different views in epistemology, the first being infinitism, the second being coherentism, and the final being foundationalism. So there's this idea that we've got to we're all in the same, we all have to face this paradox of where does our knowledge begin? All three of these views notoriously have their own problems. And so camps are divided in epistemology. And so I think that this kind of problem of, well, how do we rationally understand whether or not we're being irrational is kind of, it's either a problem for everyone or it's a problem for no one. I don't think that anyone has any special insights. I don't think that inserting God into the clockwork of epistemology gives us any sort of special insight into solving Agrippa's paradox or what is called the Munchausian trilemma.
All right.
James, while Ben has the microphone, can I just ask him really quick, because he may have a quick answer, what you would do with Plato's noble lie with respect to
James over there.
truth?
I was just picking on you.
Maybe I don't understand. In what way? What would I do with Plato's noble lie?
Well, that the
like a
idea
lie
that
that something good could come of it.
Right. Yeah. The person trying to swim a channel, and his friend tells him, "Oh, you're over halfway. You can make it." So, but you're not really halfway. You're like a quarter of a way. But the fact that he believes something false about how far along enables him to survive. And Plato thought that there were occasions of noble lie where the people needed to be lied to because it was actually better for them. And I wasn't sure if survival was truth indicator. What would you do with a counterexample like Plato's noble lie?
So I would probably embrace Plato's noble lie in this, but this would be an ethical question. So I am in some sense a consequentialist in the idea that I think that consequences matter morally, and so that we should act on rules that would make things go impartially best. And so I think if there was a rule that say, telling this noble lie to help your friend cross a channel, then that would make things go impartially best. Whereas if you didn't tell this lie, they might drown. Then we would be justified in a noble lie. So I'm not a hard and fast deontological in my ethical beliefs. I don't follow Kant in thinking that it's just always wrong to lie.
All right.
But that would, I think, get us into more moral philosophy, I think, than the epistemology part of the discussion.
All right. Well, thank you to all of our speakers. Yeah, let's carry on into the next chat there. And yeah, I know in the Zoom chat it says James Coon still. Every once in a while I will adjust it, but I am Ryan, the Nova Scotian. I'm not picking. I'm just playing. No worries. So LJ says God equals no spinning space ball with curved seawater. LJ always has this idea that we're having a different debate than what we're having. Um, kind of like what I said earlier about my name in the in the chat about me and James were actually just a time traveler, and one of us works out and the other one just sings. That's all that really happened. That's the truth of it all. All right. We're really the same person, so don't worry about it. Who's Rich Purnell? I'd like to hear, so this is the question. I'd like to hear Campbell and Howe's thoughts on Hegel's philosophy of religion and God, if any. Big thanks to the speakers and this channel. Thank you. Who's Richard
Someone
Purnell?
brought up a Hegel question and it wasn't me. This is so exciting. That's never happened.
So I've got a pretty short answer to that. Is I make all my brother Dr. Tom Howe take all the continental issues, and then I preserve myself for a more Thomistic or whatever. Not that he doesn't do that as well.
Hegel pretty much identified Geist with the flow of history, and in some ways he could be seen as a precursor to modern process philosophy or panentheism. And so to the degree that he identifies God with the historical process, as a classical theist, we just couldn't embrace that. God is wholly distinct from the universe and therefore is in no way identified with those processes.
I would echo that as well. I think Dr. Campbell hits that nail on the head in that Hegel is a monist, and that he would see that God is the progression of history through time. And so that this Hegel's model would give us, there's a question in the philosophy of religion. Well, why did God create anything at all? And so Hegel is also, the rational is the real and the real is the rational. So God can't be most real unless there is a creation that is part of him. And so that would be one advantage that you would get from a Hegelian model in philosophy of religion. But like Dr. Campbell said, that's going to be quite at odds with the Thomistic model of God. Not to say that those problems can't be ironed out. There's certainly Catholic thinkers who I very much respect, who try to do that, exactly that. I'm thinking, I have in mind Charles Taylor, who is both a Catholic and a Hegelian. And it's certainly an interesting route to go down. But I think for the models of God that we put on the table tonight, it's going to be difficult, I think, to insert Hegel's model into either of the views that we put on the table.
All right, let's hand it over to Travis. You've been off mute there. It seems like you've been waiting to respond there. So if you got some thoughts.
I keep forgetting to punch my mute button, so I'm always off mute.
No worries.
But no, I mean, I think Ben is right. I mean, would go way beyond our discussion. But to add to what he said, there are Protestant thinkers like John Cobb or Charles Hartshorne, who would echo that. They're I don't know if they depend a whole lot on Hegel. They mainly depend on Alfred North Whitehead, but there's clearly a flow of history from what Hegel was doing and into the 20th century. You see philosophers picking up those ideas and seeing process and change and evolutionism, Bergson, others, where they identify the ultimate with the evolutionary process. And again, I just don't track with that.
All right, let's move into the next question. I think that would be a good idea. We got 18 minutes left on the floor. I'm just gonna let the timer go because I forgot to keep it going earlier, so I think that's fine. Who's Rich Purnell? Thank you so much for your question. Joshua Jamie follows up here and says, all of what we know about how causation relates to existence is internal to the universe. How don't we know this worked before the Big Bang? Let's hand it over to Dr. Howe to start the response there.
I think the notions of causality are philosophical notions. So they would be true of the nature of reality that we extrapolate from what we experience in this world. So I wouldn't particularly be inclined to think that there was any challenge to trying to come to terms with causality as a philosophical notion prior to the Big Bang or whatever. I would see the question to be not that question, but I'd see our question to be more relevant with respect to causality, different kinds of causality, as Aristotle points out and Aquinas, and then causality vis-a-vis God and creation. But to me, the question about causality before or after some state in the universe seems to me relatively trivial in some respect. In other words, whatever one comes to settled conclusion about causality with respect to our experience here, if we needed to modify it as we understand the laws of nature differently, if we did that for before Planck time or something, fine. But I don't think philosophically it's going to make a difference, because it's either going to be an efficient cause or a final cause or a material cause or a which one did I leave out? Efficient, final, formal and material, or exemplar or instrumental. It's going to be those philosophical categories, it would seem to me.
All right, let's give the last word over there to Ben Bavar, if you would like to add to this question or the rebuttal to what you've heard.
Sure. I would just like to respond to the question. So I don't think that either side here is necessarily saying there is such a thing as a time before the Big Bang. So you know, I did suggest maybe the possibility of there being a beginningless per accident series of events spread over time. That is possible, perhaps, but I'm not claiming that that is the case. And so if that's not the case, there doesn't have to have been an infinite past stretching back before the Big Bang. And I don't think that our opponents are saying that there was such a thing as the time before the Big Bang either. They're talking more about causal series that exist all in a single moment. They're not claiming that really anything about how long the past has been.
All right, let's carry on, I suppose. It doesn't seem like we have a whole lot of response from the other side, and that's great because we got 15 minutes left, and we have, it seems like we have one more super chat to go. So if you have a question, I think we will have time to get to it unless we have any other ideas we want to unpack before we get to a closing statement. But before we get there, to our speakers, who we appreciate so much here at Modern Day Debate, we really love that you guys came out here to have this discussion. It's been really amicable, palatable, and all the other nice things I could say about you guys having your engagement here tonight. I really appreciate you. Samar Rowe says, I don't understand the argument that our faculties can't pick up truth if they are the result or of chance. Are these not I can't say this word. Phenomenological. It's also, there's a typo here. Phenomenological, I think they said, distinct. So if you need me to read that again without trying to pad it, I don't understand the argument that
I don't think I understand the question. Try one more time. I can't see the question, so
I could barely read it. I think that there was a typo here. So I don't understand the argument that our faculties can't pick up the truth if they are the result or of chance.
Yeah.
Are these not phenomenological distinct?
Phenomenologically distinct.
Phenomenologically,
Okay.
okay.
Yeah, and we're not saying that chance couldn't pick out.
Typo. Sorry.
Right. We're not saying that chance couldn't pick out the truth.
Right.
I mean, the old cliche, a stopped clock is right twice a day, right? But we wouldn't put a lot of stock in the clock just because at a certain moment, twice in a day, it actually is correct. So that's not an argument for the value of a stop clock to point out. And the argument isn't a stop clock never is right. It's just that when it is right, it's irrelevant to the fact that it's a clock because it's broken. So our point is that if our cognitive faculties are just the result of antecedent physical states that are mindless and in effect random to these, random in the sense that they're not being directed, but non-random in the sense that there are laws of nature and it picks out for survival. It doesn't seem to be, I mean, we've kind of gone down this road already, it seems like, but our point, just to help the questioner understand what our question was, but I think they answered the question as much as it can be answered tonight. And that is, we think that, well, if this stuff is random, then it doesn't seem that there's necessarily any way to see the connection between our thoughts and what is true. The answer is, as I understand it, there is a connection between survivability and what is true. And that's where we sort of stopped the discussion as to whether that was actually the case. And that's why I brought up the noble lie, by the way. I didn't bring that up for the sake of the ethical question. I brought it up as an example, which I thought was a counterexample of something that was false that led to survival. Since survival, and it could just be ad hoc. You say, okay, maybe like the stop clock. You might say there might be some false things that actually does lead to survival. Maybe that's the answer. But that was why I brought it up, just for the sake of the record. I wasn't really pressing the ethical side of the question, but the survivability. But that was why we were asking the question.
All right, well, let's hand it over to the other side. Ben Bavar, if you would like to make some commentary on maybe what you just heard, or Ben Watkins, it's up to you guys if you'd like to respond, or we can move to the next question.
I just want to make one comment. So even if there's no way we can be certain that survivability would be linked to true belief, like that just because a belief is true, that it would contribute to our survival. Even if we can't be certain of that, we might be able to know things and, form true beliefs, provided that our cognitive faculties just happen to be reliable. This is what's known as an externalist theory of knowledge. You don't really have to know or be certain that you know something in order to know it. And so if it just so happened, if we got lucky and our cognitive faculties do tend to produce true beliefs as a result of the way we have evolved, then I think we can still know and be rational in believing what we do believe.
All right.
I don't think I have
Go
a whole lot to add because I think I largely agree with the clarifications that Dr. Howe was able to give on the question is what it is that we were trying to discuss. And I want to apologize. I think I did misunderstand. I thought he was going the ethics route of the noble lie, but I think I've now gotten the essence of what he was trying to push is as a counterexample. And he's saying that there's a situation in which the belief is not true, but in which it would have survival advantage. And I think my own view would have to make make room for that possibility, because I think it's certainly true that we have certain beliefs because our cognitive faculties tend to have certain beliefs because they are they help our survival, but not necessarily because they are true. So a really good example, I think, of this would be something like our desire for vengeance. So this idea that we want other people to suffer for their misdeeds is something that we all tend to believe is correct, is morally right, but that's because it has survival advantages, but it's almost certainly not morally justifiable. The idea that we could want to inflict punishment on other people for the sake of their suffering in itself is very difficult to justify ethically.
All right.
And so my view would certainly have to make room for that possibility, but I think that the other side of that coin is that evolution's selected us for having cognitive faculties that can be acquainted with, systematically acquainted with other sorts of truth that might not necessarily be related to our survivability on the African savannah. So I'm thinking of calculus. So our rational faculties are capable of understanding complex mathematical truths like calculus. However, I don't think that our cognitive faculties were selected on the African savanna for their ability to learn calculus or to write poetry or to think philosophical thoughts. That these are just byproducts of more fundamental truth tracking cognitive faculties that were selected for
5 seconds.
by biological evolution for their survival advantages they afforded us on this African savanna. I'll end it there.
No worries. Did you have any commentary there, Travis, before we move on?
Yeah, if you concede that there is not a necessary connection between truth and survival, and if you're even saying that there are multiple things that we just now know that have nothing to do with our survival, I think it goes to another surprising fact on naturalism, and that is what Einstein said: the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. So that too seems to be surprising on naturalism. And it seems to me that if you're going to speak of natural selection, evolution selecting these traits for our survival, there has to be a kind of goal-directedness to this. And so I guess if I were in your position, I would readjust the definition of naturalism a bit to allow for something like that, because I just don't think that I would even be able to trust this conversation if I genuinely believe that mindless causes brought about my brain. I just don't know how I could trust it.
All right, let's carry into the next question. And with that, the only vengeance I believe in is a screaming for vengeance. What a hard album to try to sing your way through. So I don't know who out there is enjoying Judas Priest these days, but yeah, old Ryan is an old rocker.
I got that reference.
Oh, thank you. I was gonna say that's great. I actually got well, I've watched it twice, but me and my wife watched the Dreamers Never Die documentary the other night, which is the Dio documentary. Amazing. Pirate it, find it however you can. It's great. All right. So
After the Judas Priest reference, I regret that I dropped out my Stevie Wonder reference in my reply.
Oh no. What was it? No, hold on now. We got to go back. You can't just say that and just carry on. What would we miss? All right. It's all right. I won't put you on the spot.
Oh,
John,
no, I mean, I can tell you if you want to know.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead. What was
Well,
it?
I made a comment about change. When we talk about change being motion, a lot of people think of motion as locomotion. And I was just going to make the point that for Aristotle, change would be like when a leaf grows to brown when autumn comes around, which is from that Visions album of Stevie Wonder.
That's excellent. I'm here for that reference.
You say that, but from what I know, you're very superstitious. All right, let's carry on. No, I'm just carrying on. About what he said, I should say. I have to clarify before the audience comes down on me. Joshua Jamie, thank you so much for the super chat, says, correct. Causality in relation to existence is a philosophical notion about reality. I'm talking about before reality, before the Big Bang. How this reality works is relevant to how it started. Who wants to jump on this?
Yeah, so get to
yeah,
jump
okay.
in on the last question on causation here. And so I think that there's a worry here that causation is a concept that makes sense within the universe, but might not make sense when we apply it to the universe as a whole. So asking what was before the Big Bang might be like asking what is north of the North Pole. And so that when we use the concept before, we're essentially appealing to a temporal concept. But if the Big Bang is the beginning of time, the notion of before here might not get any purchase, much like asking, well, how much does the universe weigh? Well, weight only makes sense if it's relative to some massive body. Well, the universe as a whole is a collection of all massive bodies. So the idea of the weight of the universe isn't really going to have any purchase here. So it might be the case that our concept of causation is similar in that asking what caused the universe is just not sensical. And so this worry harks back at least to David Hume. And so he famously put forward this idea that there's three necessary conditions to causation. And so one of them was temporal priority, this idea that causes precede their effects. Spatial contiguity, so this idea that causally related items have a spatial location near one another, can causally contact one another, and then the idea of constant conjunction. So this idea that similar causes produce similar effects.
Okay.
And so all of these necessary conditions might pose problems to taking causation and applying it to the whole. And Hume also points out that just because causation works within the universe doesn't mean that we can extrapolate it to the whole, because that would commit what's known as the fallacy of composition. So it's true that every goose in the flock has a mother, but it's not true of the whole that the flock has a mother.
Right.
And so it might be true that everything in the universe has a cause, but it's not true that the universe as a whole has a cause.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
a couple of things.
Sorry,
I don't know who you're about to give it to, Ryan, there next. I don't want to
That's all
preempt
right.
something.
I just paused the timer because we do have another super chat that came in. So you go ahead there, Dr. Richard.
Just a couple of quick things. One, in the context in which Hume makes those conditions, continuity, contiguity, and temporal priority and stuff, are all in the context of his psychological argument for why we believe that there's causality. He wasn't making, and indeed didn't think he could even make, or anybody can make, a metaphysical argument about what causality is. It all has to do with how habits are created by constant conjunction and temporal priority and contiguousness, if you will. So it's not a metaphysical position anyway, regardless of what else we want to say about Hume. Second thing, that this came up in the writings, but it hasn't come up as a topic, but just to throw it out for what it's worth, the quantifier shift fallacy and composition and these things are irrelevant to Aquinas's argument, because the argument, whether it's a good or bad argument, only obtains if you have one contingent thing and God is its maker. So the argument isn't, since everything in the universe is caused, the universe has a cause. Even if God only made one thing, in Aquinas's understanding, it would still need a cause, which means it couldn't be a fallacy of composition because there's nothing to compose. It couldn't be a quantifier shift fallacy because the quantifiers aren't there, because you're not talking about existential and universal quantification in order to shift the quantifiers in the first place. So there may be other problems with the argument, but I think Anthony Flew and others who leveled these accusations are only able to do that because they just don't understand what the argument was to begin with.
All right. So Joshua, Jamie, they asked another question, but it seems very similar. Why do you keep appealing to what causes existence in the universe when we don't know and may never know what, if anything, caused existence before this universe? It's irrelevant to how it began. This came in as you guys started answering that. So, if you want to just kind of give a quick summary across the panel here so we can get into your closing statements and let everybody go. I'm sure that we've crossed the 3-hour mark, so we really do have to let our speakers go, everybody. I know you'd love to keep them all night, but we can't, so go ahead.
Well, I would just say the questioner is trying to press us to explain the origin of the universe or how the universe began and so on. I think Richard and I are both partial towards the Kalam argument. We actually think that there is good reason to think that there's an absolute origin to the universe, both philosophical and scientific. However, this argument just is not that, and our opponents have granted that. They understand our argument. We're not saying that the universe had a beginning. We're saying that whether it had a beginning is irrelevant to whether there's a God who's needed to cause the universe. And so just to add one more thing,
Sure thing.
causality is a metaphysical notion. And as a metaphysical notion, we think that there can be such thing as an atemporal cause of a temporal effect. And this is why the simultaneity issue I thought was actually important, because if you can't have simultaneous causes, then it is possible that from eternity, God just sustained an eternal, an accidental eternal universe in existence. So.
All right. Any thoughts on the other side of the panel before we move into closing statements?
Ben, did you have anything to add? I think I feel like we've all kind of beat this causality horse.
You think the audience knows where you guys all stand on these issues for this time?
I'm trying to think of something else to add, and I don't.
No worries.
No.
You feeling the same way there, Ben Bavar?
Yeah, I think we can move into the closing.
That sounds
That's
great.
fine.
Awesome. See, I was determined to say your name because other people are going to know how to pronounce it going forward. That's my goal, right? If I say it right, then they will too, hopefully. So we're going to go
boy.
into our closing statements. As everybody knows, I usually do this EU style. So the negative will go first. Usually in the reverse order that they went. So Ben Bavar, if you wouldn't mind going first for the closing statements. We have 6 minutes on the floor collectively, but I'll let you know when you get to the 3-minute mark, okay?
Okay, actually, Ben Watkins, he's gonna do it for our team.
All right, a full team, 6-minute on the floor. So Ben Watkins, you're ready to go. So 6 minutes on the floor. It's all yours, Ben Watkins. Thank you so much to Ben Bavar for being here. We really appreciate you for coming out here to Modern Day Debate and all your thoughts. We'll hopefully see you again going forward. If you guys haven't checked out the links in the description, they have been updated, so you can find Ben Bavar over on let me just go back here. I gotta find if you don't correct me, I gotta go back here and scroll to find the links, just so that I know what your channel is called. What is it, Ben Watkins?
Real Atheology, a Philosophy of Religion podcast.
Atheology. See, that was the word. I was like, it's real. All right. 6 minutes on the floor. It's all yours. Thanks, Ben.
So, in closing, I want to first extend our thanks to Dr. Richard Howe and Dr. Travis Campbell for sitting down with us today to discuss big questions in the philosophy of religion. Our aim at Real Atheology, a Philosophy of Religion podcast, is to facilitate high-level discussions such as this. And our aim is to raise the level of discourse in the public sphere while also equipping atheists and theists alike with the best conceptual tools possible in their journeys through big questions in the philosophy of religion. So the format of today's debate was unique in that my friend Ben Bavar and I combined our knowledge of classical theism to present a comprehensive critique of it. So in my opening statement, I defended a positive contention. So I put forward at least 2 good reasons to reject the God of classical theism. And by making use of Peirce's schema with a few minor modifications, I presented both an argument from evil and one from divine hiddenness. Both of these arguments shared a premise, so that metaphysical naturalism is a plausible alternative hypothesis to classical theism. And in defense of this premise, I argued that naturalism is both more modest and more coherent than classical theism. It's more modest because it asserts less, and it is more coherent because it does not suffer from the notorious problems of coherency that classical theism does. And so in defense of that claim, I gave at least 2 arguments. So the first I called the argument from freedom, and the second, the aloneness argument. So the former argued that God's will could be otherwise, while the latter argued God's beliefs could be otherwise. And both of those claims are incompatible with the doctrine of divine simplicity, which implies that God's will and beliefs could not have been otherwise, because they lack the potential to be otherwise because they are purely actual. And given that known facts about suffering and non-resistant non-theists are very surprising given classical theism, and a matter of course given naturalism, it follows from the law of likelihood that we have at least two reasons to believe classical theism is probably false. And again, a conclusion with the conclusion that is true, or at least probably true, constitutes what I've called a good reason. And so with my contention sufficiently motivated, Ben Bavar set out in his opening statement to defend the contention that there are no good reasons to accept the God of classical theism. So this required Ben to substantially engage with the positive case by Dr. Howe and Dr. Campbell. So Ben argued that the causal premise of their argument lacks sufficient support. Even Dr. Howe and Dr. Campbell's examples of causation suggest that when contingent events and states of affairs are explained, they are explained by prior events and not ongoing causation. Moreover, Dr. Howe and Dr. Campbell failed in their opening statement to present an example of a per se series of substances causing other substances to exist. On our opponent's behalf, Ben offered a potential example of a per se series of makers, namely coffees being sustained by its constituent particles. He then put forth a variety of ways to account for this case without positing an unmade maker. One is to deny the coffee is caused by its parts just because it depends on them. In that case, there is no per se causal series to explain. Another is to concede coffee is caused by its parts, but propose each of its parts is sustained by further parts, as matter is infinitely divisible. So Ben admitted this was nothing more than a metaphysical speculation, but that we should look to science for evidence for and against it. He noted the scientific consensus is that elementary particles are not composed of particles from which we may infer they lack parts. This led him finally to explain elementary particles in terms of per accidens series, like the one involved in pair production. Then during the response and dialogue, Ben challenged the derivation of virtually every divine attribute that Aquinas endorses. He thereby undercut any inference from an uncaused cause to the God of Thomism. And so with that said, that is my Ben Watkins and Ben Bavar's critique of the classical theist model of God. And again, I want to end by thanking Dr. Howe and Dr. Campbell for having such a wonderful discussion with us tonight. This was certainly stimulating, and I hope that people will be able to take a lot from these exchanges that we've had, whether you're an atheist or a theist, trying to grapple with big questions in the philosophy of religion. And with that, I'd like to turn things back over to Dr. Howe and Dr. Campbell in closing.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ben Watkins, for being here, and Ben Bavar. And for thanking me, which you didn't. And now I feel personally assaulted. No, I'm kidding. The thing that's really bothering me is this fly. He's trying to Mike Pence me. He got on my mic. He's everywhere. He's driving me crazy, guys. Anyways, 6 minutes on the floor. We'll start with you, Dr. Howe.
All right, I'm going to take about a minute and a half, and I'm going to turn it over to Travis for an extended closing. But, certainly just appreciate everybody being here tonight, and also what it took to make this happen, because I had little to nothing to do with it, because I was out of the country for an extended period, and basically everybody else was doing all the hard work to make all the machinations and settling on the format, and I get to come in at the last minute and get to be a part of it. So I'm very grateful for that opportunity. And I would say I found both Bens to be very thoughtful and very keen-minded in their treatment of these, and very charitable, men of integrity. And I look forward to the future of being able to engage them either formally like this, or even grabbing a coffee somewhere if we happen to be close to one another in the lower 48. Also, I'd like to just say that if anybody in listening to this, either live or the recording, is interested in theological studies and philosophical studies from this Christian perspective that Travis and I are talking about, then I invite you to check out Southern Evangelical Seminary, ses.edu. Our philosophy, classical realism or Thomistic realism or Thomism, goes by a lot of different things, undergirds the way we do our systematic theology and the way we do our apologetics. So I invite you to do that. And then if you have trouble falling asleep one night, check out richardghowe.com. I'm not a web developer. It's kind of a cheesy looking, but I think all the links work on it. And you can get a lot of material from my website there, from me and from others regarding these kind of issues in philosophy, theology, and apologetics at richardghowe.com. And I'll turn it over to Travis.
All right, you got 4 minutes on the floor. You might want to come off mute there, Travis. Here, I'll just pause the timer while we get you off mute. All right, you're back and running. So, Travis, you've got the last word. Thank you so much for coming to Modern Day Debate. It was super exciting to see you in that email thread earlier. Honestly, I was like, oh, he's doing it. I hadn't heard from you in a while, and I was very excited to hear that you were coming back to Modern Day Debate to debate. So, 4 minutes on the floor. It's all yours.
Well, thank you, Richard. And I would like to thank Ryan and the team at Modern Day Debate for hosting this exchange on their channel. I'm also especially grateful for Ben and Ben, who have proven that people can disagree in an agreeable fashion. We thank them for the criticisms of our position, as well as what was at times a spirited exchange, and maybe not for the audience as much as some of these debates can be, but we really enjoyed it. I hope this is not the end, but the beginning of a long dialogue between the four of us. And all of you have an open invitation to Pretoria Fields Brewery, where I actually am a DJ. I play reggae music and classic rock every Friday night. So if you ever want to come down and have a beer with me and listen to some good music, that would be great. Richard indicated that our disagreements with both Bens centered around the soundness of our argument. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
We sure can.
Well, our contention is that our opponents, in their affirmation of things like existential inertia, confuse the very principles we demonstrated are really distinguished. Concerning the coherence of theism, we submit that the arguments from freedom and aloneness are unsound, as they fail to appreciate the resources long established in Thomistic metaphysics that our ontology provides, and offering a consistent, albeit mysterious, doctrine of the divine nature.
Oh no. You're cutting out, Travis. No. I was going to say, you were getting right to the good part. Just give yourself 1 second. You've cut out.
The cause of the universe, but as he is free at the same time. We also had a dispute about methodology, and we pointed out that we disagree with it, but even on their own methodology, turns out theism.
Here, I'll turn off his video to see if that helps clear it up. Oh no. Travis, if you can hear us, hopefully you just take a moment just to hold your thought. Yeah, you were really on a roll there, and then, oh no, we've lost it.
I've got the printout of his closing. If we can't get him back on, I'm happy to read it or whatever you think.
Well, he's just backed out for a second here, guys. So let's just go over to our regular screen here. That's great. I wanted to ask him what kind of classic rock he likes to play at his open mics there, or whatever he likes to do. There he is. He is back, everybody. Travis.
Did I get cut off?
You did. So if you want to just wind back.
Can you hear me?
I sure can. and the
Yes,
audience
we
can
can hear
too.
you now.
Yeah,
So
I'm not able to hear you, but I can finish my talk if that's okay.
yeah,
Yes,
so you
please.
were at the part where you were talking about
He
the
can't hear us.
methodology of where we were disagreeing on the methodology. So that was at the part where when you cut out.
Well, I was just going to just
Oh, maybe
close by saying that our disagreements, I think we had a real clash in this debate because I think we know where we each other stands. I think that the theism turns out to be the more plausible view, not only given our metaphysical argument for God's existence, but also the fact that we have things that are surprising on theism. Sorry, that are surprising on naturalism, and not just things that are surprising on theism. So, given the abductive method as well as our metaphysical approach, I think that the quantity and quality of evidence renders theism the superior worldview to naturalism. I think that our opponents would also would at least agree with this, that we're not going to settle all of the disputes between us in one debate. In fact, a lot of the audience may have been confused about the jargon that Richard and I were using as we were giving our arguments. These are tough issues to deal with, and the metaphysical terms we were using are just not familiar to people. But I do have one or two books to recommend. Matt Fradd's book, Does God Exist? A Socratic Dialogue on the Five Ways, is a very accessible book to lay people. And Norman Geisler's book, God, A Philosophical Argument from Being, is another accessible work. So I will just end with a quotation that I think we can all agree with from the New Testament. Jesus said, "Seek and you will find, and when you find the truth will set you free." So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Travis, for your closing thoughts. Like I said, it's really cool to see you back here at Modern Day Debate. Doing the debate thing. We had a little discussion about that, me and you privately, but yeah, this has been great. Richard Howe, Dr. Richard Howe, I should say. Once again, really great to have you here. Ben Watkins, I want to see you guys come back, all of you guys, because it's been a really amicable discussion. I think our audience would agree that this has been an enjoyable discussion overall, an enjoyable debate. I got to come up with new words. They get all angry with me if I say the same word twice. So, and also Ben Bavar. Everybody, this has been great. If you haven't liked this discussion, I don't know what's wrong with you. You're silly. Hit the like button. It doesn't get much better than this as far as, like I say, an amicable discussion between gentlemen. True gentlemen, this has been fantastic. Yeah, if you haven't already, check these guys out in the spaces that they reside in. If we don't have them tagged in the description, we will try to get that updated as soon as we can, so you guys know exactly where you can find these guys. And with that, once again, I'll remind everybody to hit the like, hit the subscribe if you haven't already. We really appreciate it. Modern Day Debate, and we're going to keep on trying to sift out the reasonable from the unreasonable. And if you enjoy that too, then we hope to see you there. Along with, last little thing, I know I was just on a roll. I thought I was going to close there for a second, but I got to remind people we have our live event coming up. It's going to be in New Jersey. We're going to have real people. Can you believe it? Real people are going to be there, not just on screen, but there's depending on dates, because there's a couple dates that are in the air. I'm probably going to be there. James is going to be there. Destiny's probably going to be there. A couple other people that you've seen on Modern Day Debate. So keep an eye out for that. And once again, thanks everybody. We'll see you next time. I'm going to let our speakers go. Cheers. Wasting time, all of my life, living in a world of regression, journeys mixed with self-oppression. What am I to do but tear away when I'm boiling at the top? Try to find a way to fight the fire, smart to rap from the minds of liars, and call the shots as you bow your heads, and the march never stops. The stars could be free, but this insanity bends you right by the knee. Running in circles now for something that can't be found. Out of breath as you hit the wall, the rain starts to fall. You can run away, sing a tune that's true. I'll be beside you. Who's the one that holds you down? Push through there in your way, anything to make you stay. Cut the strings before your life starts to decay. From tears of blood, regrets of laughter, turn around as your heart beat faster. Your hollow shape as the faith begins to drop. Shelter can find your thoughts of suicide. It's hanging down by the fray. Running in circles now for something that can't be found, and there's no time for today. You prayed away that the world would be untrue. I will rise against you. Circles now for something that can't be found. Out of breath, smashed the wall, the water consumed all. You prayed away that the world would be untrue as it rose against you. Did you think it would always be for free? Now sit back, watch it burn, burn, burn for all eternity.